A 34-year-old, long-haired man stumbles through a city that's been utterly demolished, figuring this place had to be hell. Sword in hand, he couldn't help but wonder how everything had gone so terribly wrong. He figured if he'd just learned swordplay sooner, he might have been able to stop his sister from being sent away to the Empire. If that had happened, maybe he wouldn't have turned into the monster he'd become. He was just so tired of it all. Besides, he might have met his master under much better circumstances than he did. A girl with black hair was staring daggers at him, but the young man was completely lost in thought, reminiscing about his master. He was thinking about how he'd spent the best days of his life with him, and how the man was so much more to him than just a savior. With a heavy sigh, he knew he would have treated him better if he'd realized how much he'd regret it. Sitting there with his ink-stained sword, the fighter panted from exhaustion, and looking at the destruction he'd brought upon the village, he was certain this wasn't what he wanted. Then someone holding a sword started walking toward him, immediately putting the young man on high alert. A little boy was pointing a sword at him, trembling with fear. It was a pretty pathetic sight, honestly. So, the man said he had no quarrel with children and that this was no way to treat him. But the kid kept the blade aimed at his face, claiming he had killed his father. For a split second, the young man actually looked remorseful, but then he just scoffed at the boy's feelings, which made Jack even more furious, calling him a monster. Deep down, the man actually cared what the kid had to say, but monster was a nickname he was well acquainted with by now. At that moment, he was far more concerned with his entire body tingling and throbbing with agony. He felt a piercing pain and the sensation that his brain could melt at any second, sending constant signals to just stop, to just end it all. However, staring at the blonde-haired boy, he knew he had to hold on just a little longer, just a little more. Then he asked, "A monster, you say?" He continued, saying that he was indeed the monster, since he single-handedly destroyed all the masters and brought an end to the great nation of the Tulkun Empire and its imperial family. The man asked if the boy had any idea how many people he'd already annihilated, leaving the child completely speechless. Grinning with pride, he claimed to have wiped out more than hundreds of thousands. So, it was pretty obvious he was a monster. His words burrowed into the little blonde's head, who began to tremble even more while trying to keep his sword raised. Seeing the boy like that reminded him of when he was a young monster himself, and he asked for his name. But when the boy replied, Jack Stewart, the warrior's entire expression changed. He noted that, coincidentally, his name was also Jack, and then he just burst into laughter. He said he'd taken down a lot of people but didn't remember any named Stewart. The kid's voice trembled as he explained that even if his father wasn't anyone important, he was still the father he needed. Pausing to think, the man could almost feel a twinge of envy. Still, he wasn't going to apologize for what he did. Instead, he would give the boy a chance, which left the blonde kid totally confused. Pointing to the boy's sharp sword, he told him to use it and stab him. The boy was sweating bullets from the whole situation and looked more lost than ever. But the man just insisted that this was the perfect opportunity to avenge his father and be hailed as the hero who defeated the monster. And he knew he could probably escape, even with a mangled leg and some injured organs, but that just wasn't what he wanted anymore. So he kept taunting the kid until the boy finally raised the sword, still shaking, to strike him down. However, all he did was collapse to his knees before the monster. Seeing tears streaming down his face, the man was surprised that the boy couldn't bring himself to do it. He reached out and gently caressed the boy's hair, congratulating him, because he knew the kid wouldn't be able to live in peace if he'd gone through with it. After all, a hero has to carry the weight of many names on his back. He then advised him to live a life without regrets, unlike himself. Because unlike the man, the little blonde kid was still young. In response, the boy just broke down in tears, as you'd expect. Slowly, the long-haired man's determination began to weaken. He then asked the child to tell the others that the demon was finished, and with him, the war. This prompted the little one to ask, "Mister, why? With all that power, why did you choose to live like this?" He gripped his sword, searching for the strength to explain, but he collapsed to the ground before he could finish. That was the end. He could feel the sensation in his fingers fading away, like a balloon slowly losing its air. His vision started to blur, and against his will, his eyelids grew heavy and shut. For a split second, he forgot to even breathe as the world around him went completely silent. In his final moments, a single thought consumed him. If he could just start over from scratch, could he possibly escape this miserable fate? And just like that, he found himself waking up as if from a long dream. Suddenly, a young boy once more. Memories flooded back. His father doubting he was his own flesh and blood, his mother's death just after childbirth, his stunningly beautiful older sister, and even the half-brother who made his life a living hell. He recalled it all how he cast aside the name Jack Valente to become a wandering swordsman, journeying across the entire continent. His life flashed before his eyes, blurring the line between dream and reality until he couldn't tell the difference. Had he truly died? And was this just the final highlight reel? A cold sweat broke out as the little boy felt himself teetering on the edge of a breakdown. Then came the memories of the Second Continental War. He remembered being the victor, a merciless conqueror, the most fearsome monster on a battlefield full of them. Fueled by pure vengeance, he'd crushed the Tulkun Empire, seized control of the western continent and utterly annihilated anyone with the Tulkun name. Once he declared victory, a sense of satisfaction washed over him. With his goals achieved, he willingly accepted his own end, seeing no reason left to live, and so, his heart gave out. But if that was true, then what in the world was happening? Because the young boy he now inhabited was none other than his past self, Jack. In a panic, he wondered how this could even be possible, pinching himself hard to make sure it wasn't all some crazy dream. He was back in the house of Valente Marcus, a famous family in the Teslan kingdom, known for their unwavering loyalty to the king. And here he was, once again the youngest of the siblings, the youngest son of the family holding the esteemed Marcus title. He realized if he hadn't been so greedy for the Harris title in his past life, things could have been so much easier. But his home within the estate was a different story. As he walked through the rose garden, the boy looked over the place he knew all too well. It was more of an annex, really, tucked away in a far corner of the property. It looked beautiful from the outside, but that was just a facade. In reality, this place was his prison, his exile. Its sole purpose was to completely isolate the youngest son, cutting him off from the world with no servants or family to even speak to. That was the real rose garden. Jack was jolted from his thoughts when a voice called out, offering him something to drink. It was Ron, the butler, the only person in this whole place who ever showed him any kindness. Jack thought to himself that the Ron from his memories was a sharp guy. Taking the glass, young Jack casually asked if there was any poison in the juice, which made the servant flinch, but Jack quickly laughed it off as a joke and thanked him for his trouble. Ron chuckled, telling him not to push his luck, and then left the boy to himself. All told, there were 11 other people in the garden, not counting our hero. One was the butler, but the other 10 were guards, their eyes constantly on him. He mused that besides his caretaker, he couldn't imagine anyone else who needed this much surveillance. This constant watch, ironically, gave him a lot of time to think. He was now certain this was all real, though he still couldn't fathom how he'd been sent back in time. It had only been about an hour since he'd realized the truth. He didn't have a grand plan or anything yet. He was just 14 years old again, and his body reflected that. His hands were soft, without a single callus, and he couldn't feel a man of heart inside him. Compared to other noble kids his age, he was completely pathetic, but there was a very specific reason for his weakness back then. He hadn't awakened his mana yet. As this thought crossed his mind, a figure crept up behind him, ready to strike. A sudden, sharp pain exploded in the back of his head. He let his guard down completely. It dawned on him that it had been decades since someone had managed to get a cheap shot like that on him. "You shouldn't bother a dog when it's eating," the man sneered, glancing at the shattered glass of juice on the ground. That voice sent a shiver down Jack's spine. The dark-haired man then griped, "Is that any way to greet your big brother?" It was Phelan Valente, his brother, 3 years, his senior and the second son of the Marcus family. He was also the very reason Jack had never been able to train his mana. Thanks to the abuse from this one psycho, his past self had been utterly powerless. The young boy glared at him, pure hatred in his eyes. Even after decades had passed, the memory of his brother was burned into his mind. He was hit with a sudden flashback, Phelan pouring a hot drink right over his head. He remembered the words being called useless, that he should just be gotten rid of, and that he was forbidden from learning a single thing. Not fencing, not magic, absolutely nothing. Because if Jack dared to try, Phelan would call it a betrayal to his older brother and use it as the perfect excuse to completely crush him. Phelan had warned him that as long as he was under that roof, he'd only get the scraps they decided to give him. Then, with a twisted laugh, that creep suggested things might change if Jack became his personal puppet. Maybe then, he'd consider calling him a younger brother, but only after Phelan himself became a marquis. Back in the day, Jack had been incredibly frail, a fact he couldn't deny. To everyone else in that mansion, he was nothing but inferior. It's how he earned the title, the disgrace of the house. Of course, that lovely nickname was kept strictly behind closed doors. If word got out, it would just be even more humiliating the pathetic third son of the Amaro family. He could still hear the laughter, even from the common servants in his own home, echoing in his ears. That was his life, and the ringleaders behind it all were the family's second son and Count Mantis. The way Phelan acted was completely absurd, especially considering the actual firstborn of the family wasn't a son, but a daughter. She was the one and only person in that family he could ever trust, the only one who actually cared about him. But sadly, despite being a year older than their middle brother, her gender barred her from ever becoming the family heir. She was relegated to being just the beautiful firstborn, a trophy who could never inherit the title. Her entire life was practically mapped out for her from birth. She was destined for a political marriage to a family their father approved of, fated to live out her days trapped in a mansion, all to continue the bloodline. That was the state of affairs when Jack made his return, and this jerk standing right in front of him was the one most eager to use his sister as a pawn. This piece of work couldn't stand being seen with the family's useless black sheep, nor did he want his younger sister anywhere near him at the royal court. He deserved to be utterly demolished right then and there, but Jack was pulled from his vengeful thoughts when Phelan suddenly commented on his eyes. Winding up to strike the child, he snarled, asking how he dared to look at him like that. But before his hand could connect, Jack shot his own hand out and grabbed his wrist, boldly stopping the attack, leaving Phelan completely stunned and putting the garden guards on high alert. Nothing like this had ever happened before. But Jack didn't even flinch. He was dead set on never suffering that humiliation a second time. Meanwhile, Phelan was absolutely losing his mind, completely floored that he'd been stopped by someone he considered less than an insect. Our hero moved like lightning, sending the bully sprawling to the ground with a single, clean move. From the dirt, Phelan sputtered, demanding to know what his brother thought he was doing. With a smirk, Jack coolly asked if he needed a hand getting up. That just sent Phelan over the edge. He unsheathed his sword, mana flaring to life as he hurled every nasty name in the book at the young boy. The guards thought about intervening, but they knew that would only tick off the second young master even more, a reaction Jack was, quite frankly, counting on. To him, this whole ridiculous scene was just a joke, but before Phelan could make a move, Ron, the servant, jumped between the two brothers to stop the fight, yelling at him to get a grip and reminding him that using mana in a petty squabble like this was forbidden. But Phelan couldn't have cared less, and just decked the servant right in the face to get him out of his path. The guy was completely unhinged. As Jack watched this unfold, he recalled that Ron was a man who had plenty of his own secrets. Shoving a finger in Jack's face, he bellowed, "You arrogant little punk. I'll finish you and that servant off together." But our main character was completely unfazed. In fact, he just shot back that his brother sure did talk a lot. He then sarcastically asked if Phelan planned to fight with his mouth instead of his sword. At that, the blade was finally drawn, and Jack's eyes blazed with fury, realizing this wasn't just an empty threat. Even without any training in this new body and with no mana to back him up, he knew he wasn't going to lose. He charged forward, watching the man tense up at his sudden assault. Phelan's power was only at the third circle, and that was the extent of his abilities. Despite the fancy sword, he was nothing more than a spoiled brat, and with that pathetic swordsmanship, Jack figured he'd be lucky to slice a piece of butter. Our hero briefly considered just tossing him on the ground again, but decided that wouldn't be nearly enough. A wicked grin spread across his face as he told Phelan he was about to get a much-needed lesson in mental fortitude, a comment that clearly put his brother on edge. The guy was so stunned he couldn't even talk, just sputtering random curses. You'd think when someone pumps their body full of mana, they remember to send some to their brain. With that thought, Jack planted his fist right in his brother's smug face, and he didn't feel a single ounce of regret. It was only fair to pay back 100% of the humiliation that Jerk had put him through. Each punch sent Phelan staggering until he finally collapsed onto the ground like the pathetic coward he was, right where he belonged. Jack even leaned in to check for a pulse, since his dear brother wasn't moving a muscle. All eyes were glued on the boy, a mix of shock and fear dawning on them as they witnessed Jack's incredible power. The moment he saw a guard reaching for his spear, he shot them a deadly look and ordered them to back off, warning them that unless they wanted to end up just like his brother, they'd do as he said. That little threat sent everyone scrambling to look busy elsewhere. With the audience taken care of, he turned back to the moron on the pavement and yanked him up by the hair. Jack dragged him across the courtyard, casually remarking that he should really think about losing a few pounds. All the while, Phelan just whimpered in pain as they stopped at the edge of a fountain. Jack then noted how scorching hot it was and offered to help his big brother cool off a bit. And just like that, he dunked the scumbag's head straight into the fountain without a second thought. Phelan must have been shocked that he couldn't even summon that precious mana he was so proud of. As he held him under, Jack's mind drifted back to all the misery he'd endured because of this son of a gun. Right after their sister was married off for the Empire's sake, Phelan had taken out their own father with a poisoned drink, seizing power only to run the family into the ground and achieve absolutely nothing. The once great Marcus family had completely vanished from the map. Despite all that, our hero wasn't just interested in simple revenge for his family, but he was absolutely furious, remembering how Phelan had thrown away their sister's sacrifice. She was a brilliant and graceful woman, and he couldn't even fathom what she must have gone through when she got to the Empire. She had gone willingly, all for the honor of their family, and she must have known exactly what she was getting into, because her new husband was the fourth imperial prince, a man infamous for being a total degenerate. He even had the nerve to tell her at the altar that she wouldn't even be his official wife. He ordered her to just keep her head down, do as she was told, and smile. And because she loved her family so much, his sister put up with every last bit of it, just nodding along to every command. If Phelan and their late father had any idea what her life became, things might have turned out differently. But Jack pushed the thought away before he completely lost it. The scumbag started gurgling his name, begging for his miserable life like a pathetic bug. But after years of being a monster, Jack was all too familiar with this scene. It was the same look everyone gets when they're staring death in the face. So he told him to take a moment and think about every rotten thing he'd ever done, every insult he'd ever hurled at him. But of course, he probably couldn't remember a single one. Jack then offered to help jog his memory, figuring a little first-hand experience was in order. Only then would he finally learn the meaning of family. His younger brother's chilling words terrified Phelan. When he got nothing but silence, Jack raised his fist and demanded an answer, one way or another. Finally, the man choked out that he was wrong, pleading for him to stop. However, Jack only paused when a third voice joined in with the same request. Standing over by the gazebo, Ram pleaded for him to end it. His plea earned a quiet grumble from Jack, who then slammed his brother's head against the fountain's edge before dropping him. Jack then called over a guard, who jumped at the sound of his voice and ordered him to haul away this useless sack of a brother, adding that he didn't care what happened to him, whether he lived or died. He just wanted him out of his sight. The knight immediately rushed over to the young master, concerned about his condition. As Jack walked past Ron, the butler stared at him, his expression clearly saying he couldn't believe what he'd just witnessed. It didn't take long for word of his actions to spread like wildfire, throwing the entire mansion into chaos. Phelan was hauled into the house by a couple of servants, which scared a purple-haired lady so badly she fainted on the spot. And so, the great heir of the Marcus family was now stuck in bed with a nasty gash on his head and a newfound crippling fear of water. Given the circumstances, things were bound to get a little chaotic. But even with all the commotion, Jack just casually strolled back to his room. He started savoring a slice of cake as if nothing had happened. Under Ron's watchful eye, the servants whispered all over the mansion, wondering how the kid managed to beat his older brother, a guy who'd already reached the third circle at 17. All this, when our hero supposedly didn't know the first thing about magic or martial arts. Maybe he was just hiding his true strength. But why reveal his hand right at that moment? Phelan was set to be named heir next week after his coming-of-age ceremony, which made it seem like the kid was making a play for the position. The uproar was so massive that even his sister was getting worried about the whole situation. When word of this reached the Lord's ears, he immediately summoned his third son, who was still busy enjoying his cake, even complimenting the butler who had baked it so carefully. This went on until a maid pulled the servant aside, telling him something that clearly threw him for a loop. So, he informed the young master that the Lord had requested his presence in the main building. Jack just stood up and waved off the butler's offer to escort him, saying he wasn't a baby anymore. Like the loyal servant he was, the butler obeyed his young master's order, only asking him to be careful. The palace was huge, and during the long walk, Jack felt like all eyes were on him. It was a strange feeling, especially since he'd been completely ignored for so long. Not that he really cared how people saw him, he just wanted to get this over with. As soon as he reached the door, the guards immediately blocked his path. They were acting like he was invisible, which he found totally absurd. The kid tried to get the guards' attention politely, but it was no use. So, he just swept his foot right under both of their legs, asking if they were blind or deaf while everyone else watched the scene unfold, not so subtly. If this had been the old Jack, he would have just left after seeing the disgusted look on the knight's face. But he wasn't about to do that this time. Smiling, he told them to wipe those dumb looks off their faces before he smashed them in. Now that time's got a reaction. The guard wanted to make sure he'd heard correctly. In response, Jack kicked the jerk square in the knee, dropping him to the ground, and said he wouldn't ask a second time. He explained that he'd been summoned by the Lord himself, so he wanted to know why they were refusing to let him in. The answer came out in a trembling voice, with the man saying he couldn't say. That's when Jack realized they were just making him wait outside for no good reason. They probably expected a big scene where they'd tell him he wasn't worthy and could only enter after begging for forgiveness. But instead, the kid just turned his back on them. When they asked where he was going, he shot back. "Where do you think?" Leaving the guard completely speechless. Then Jack told him to inform the Lord that if he had something to say, he could come to his quarters, because he wasn't going to stand around for this nonsense. The two guards could only conclude that he'd finally snapped. One of the Lord's servants entered his office to report that the boy had left, apologizing for the failure. The Lord just cracked a small smile when he heard, realizing his youngest son had really changed. Meanwhile, out in the rose garden, Jack was having a snack, totally confident he'd be getting a visitor soon. And right on cue, something on the horizon caught his eye. Speak of the devil. There was the Lord, accompanied by his usual entourage of servants and relatives. The stubbornness was written all over his face. Jack couldn't help but laugh. The man hadn't changed one bit from what he remembered. He thought of his father as nothing more than a ghost from his past, after all. This was the man who tried to get rid of Jack in his previous life. He was the type of person who would sell out his own child for a taste of power, because that's exactly what he'd done. The man was hungry for power way beyond his reach and was too blind to see his own reckless ambition. Jack greeted the old man he could never bring himself to call father. But the Lord wasn't interested in pleasantries. He cut right to the chase, demanding to know why he did it. To which Jack just played dumb, asking what on earth he was talking about. That response set off the purple-haired lady, who shrieked, asking how he dared to speak to the Lord that way. Either way, Jack suggested they all go inside to talk more comfortably, unless they preferred to stay out here. Then, a ridiculous amount of mana started pouring out of the old man, who seemed to be checking if the boy had secretly formed a mana heart. He quickly concluded that wasn't the case. He pointed out that Jack had a real talent for fighting and wondered why he'd kept it a secret all this time. Of course, the real answer was, "You'd never believe I traveled back in time," so Jack just shrugged and said he didn't feel like showing off. That's when the young woman started yapping again, calling him a disrespectful brat and just the son of some commoner. But she clammed up the moment the Lord ordered her to, who then chimed in that maybe the boy wasn't as completely useless as he'd first thought. This totally set our hero off, who fired back, asking if he'd stop being his son the moment he became useless. The Marquis then asked if Jack actually wanted to be recognized as his son, but Jack couldn't care less about that right now. The old man just turned his back, saying he understood his youngest son, and then simply walked away, with Jack watching the whole group leave. Jack was totally baffled why his father would even show up just to leave without getting the least bit angry. Then, thinking about his stepmother, our MC decided to throw a little shade her way, mentioning that after everything that went down with her son, a whole lot of new wrinkles were popping up, and that she really ought to take better care of herself. Her face flushed with fury at his concern, and she almost snapped her fan in half over that disrespectful little punk. A smirk crept across Jack's face. That woman had never lifted a finger to help him, so seeing her that ticked off was incredibly satisfying. He stood up, gave a mock bow, and asked them to send his regards to the second son sarcastically, of course. Back in his room, the butler formally announced that Jack Valente, the third son of the family, was sentenced to 20 days of solitary confinement for causing a ruckus in the mansion. But then, Ron hesitated, asking what on earth happened while he was away. But our MC just told him to zip it and not interrupt what he was doing. He knew for a fact that Ron would have just looked the other way if Phelan had been the one beating him up. So, why was he so worked up now? Pausing his drawing for a moment, Jack mused on the whole idea of solitary confinement. He'd already been banished to the Rose Garden, so he couldn't see how solitary would be much different. It was just another room, right? Snapping him out of his thoughts, the butler mentioned that there was less than a month of the academy break left, and here he was, already getting locked up. Jack just froze, completely confused. He'd totally forgotten about school, having lived a completely different life for so long. Now that he was 14 years old again, he had to attend the Imperial Academy. Every single aristocrat in the Teslan Empire was required to study there. Unless you had a serious disability, daily attendance was mandatory. It was a 4-year program that started when you were 14, which meant Jack was still in his first year. The first semester was over, so it was now summer break. It felt bizarre to think of himself as a student again. In his past life, his connections to the academy meant he could skip pretty much any class, with one notable exception. That's why he wasn't about to waste any more time arguing with his father over something so trivial. When he thought about it logically, his only real choice was to go to the academy. He still had 27 days of vacation left. 20 of those would be in confinement, and it would take 6 days to travel to school from there. In other words, he was being shipped straight to the academy the moment his sentence was up. Even though it was his own past, he was having a hard time understanding the choices he'd made. Looking exhausted, Ron asked if the young master was done with his painting. Jack got up from his chair, touched the easel, and asked exactly where he was supposed to serve this confinement. The butler's silence quickly got on our MC's nerves, so he asked again, more forcefully. That's when the blonde explained that there was only one place for people who were being punished. Prison, reserved for criminals who'd committed crimes within the Marquis' territory. Jack was floored. He asked uncertainly, "You mean I'm being thrown in an actual prison?" The answer was yes, which, honestly, wasn't a total shock. Still, a yell of pure frustration escaped him. He couldn't believe that stubborn old fool would actually go that far. The academy's vacation wasn't really a break. It was just more time for social climbing and politics. You could tell just by looking at what Phelan was up to. Before this, he was always off at social gatherings, networking with other noble families, and meeting vassals. Jack, on the other hand, never got to do any of that. Not that he really cared about the Marquis' business, anyway, but the way his family acted still infuriated him. It was like they were saying there was no place for him in the family or anywhere else, and now he was being tossed into a filthy cell. And it was all thanks to that idiotic old man. Jack decided he'd walk to the prison himself, without an escort, just to preserve some shred of his dignity. As he left, Ron's face was a comical mess of pity. He was actually dabbing his eyes with a handkerchief, looking at Jack like he was an abandoned puppy, while our MC just told them to hurry it up already. In some ways, his situation was a bit different from the other prisoners. After all, he got a bed, a bathroom, and 3 square meals a day. But what good is any of that when you're stuck in a tiny, freezing cell with a blanket that hasn't seen laundry day in 50 years and food so nasty even the flies wouldn't touch it? Our boy just crosses his arms. With nothing but time on his hands, days of it, a teenager's mind can really start to wander. See, nobles with their own land could basically do whatever they wanted, punishing people under their own local laws instead of the empire's. In fact, inside their own territory, they pretty much had the same power as the emperor himself. Now, Jack might have been thrown in here by the Marquis, but he was still his son, a noble through and through. It's not like he started a rebellion or something crazy, but his own father still decided to lock him up anyway. He started wondering how his old man was going to spin this whole mess to protect his precious second son. Claim Jack used poison or some forbidden artifact? Nah, that'd be a little over the top. Oh. You can bet the Marquis had already cooked up a perfect story to explain what happened to Fleen. Something like, Jack Valente, the family disgrace, delved into forbidden magic out of pure greed. Then my heroic second son, Fleen, found out and tried to set his little brother straight, but the boy was just too stubborn. Making things worse, Jack used that dark magic on his own brother to shut him up. But even in his suffering, the noble heir found it in his heart to forgive his foolish little brother. That's probably the exact story playing out in the minds of the Marquis and Marchioness right now. The thought alone was sickening. For Jack, a few days in this dump was whatever, but there was no way he was wasting his precious second chance at life in a pathetic dump like this prison. It wasn't like he had any lingering love for his family. He could totally make a break for it right now, but he held back for 3 reasons. His sister, Ron, and most importantly, his master. Oh, and yeah, there was the minor detail that he was back in his original body, meaning he was just a scrawny 14-year-old kid, way too weak to make it on his own. He wasn't an idiot. He knew the #1 rule of this world. The strong eat the weak, the toughest survive, and the rest become food or fertilizer. Jack had no plans to repeat the bloody rampage of his past life, but he still had a long list of people who needed to pay. To pull that off, he needed 2 things: time and power. And conveniently, the Academy was the perfect place to get both. It would give him the time he needed to reclaim his old strength, building on the insane power he already had thanks to his past life experience. Once he did that, he'd finally be able to protect the people he cared about: Ron, his sister, and his master. And to get there, he had to claim what was rightfully his, whether he liked it or not. Slowly, mana started to gather in his hands. Now, a mana user's skill is broken down into 10 ranks. The 1st through 3rd circles are for beginners. From the 4th to the 6th, you've got your specialists. 7th to 9th are high circle users, and the absolute rarest, the 10th circle, are called masters or even superhumans. Pressing his palms to his chest, Jack summoned a blue glow. It was a damn good thing no one was around to see this. It only took him 2 hours to form the 1st circle, a feat that made him grateful for his youth. In his past life, he hadn't even started with mana until he was 17, probably because of that classic teenage impatience. He raised his hand, letting the glowing circle hover above him, marveling at his own work, before quickly snuffing it out, remembering that nobody could find out what he was up to. Just then, a strange sound echoed from the hall, like the clicking of the Marquis's shoes. Jack quickly wrapped himself in the blanket and played dead, but he soon realized the footsteps were lighter than usual. And the voice he heard belonged to someone who, in his past life, he'd only seen in the most distant memories, and it made him bolt upright. There, on the other side of the bars, stood his tearful sister, Jack Valente. She reached her hands through the bars, her voice filled with worry as she asked if he was badly hurt. Tears welled up in his eyes, seeing his beloved sister, still so beautiful and kind, visiting him in a place like this. And when she called him Jackie, it was like music to his ears, a nickname he hadn't heard in a lifetime. He pressed her hand to his cheek and managed a smile, telling her he wasn't hurt and that everything was okay. Still worried, Elizabeth asked why he'd resorted to forbidden magic when she'd offered to teach him herself any time. Their hands clasped together as he apologized, but his sister suddenly changed the subject, asking why he'd come home early. The question was met with dead silence, and his sudden freeze clearly unsettled her. So, she checked in, asking if he was really all right and could even hear her. But all he did was wipe his tears and crack a smile, explaining that he was just happy. His reaction completely baffled Elizabeth. I mean, how could anyone be happy in a situation like this, trapped in a cold, disgusting cage all by himself? But Jack just revealed he was ecstatic that this wasn't another dream, that he was finally seeing his sister again. His words only convinced Elizabeth that the boy had completely lost his mind. But then, his expression turned dead serious, grabbing her full attention. He finally made the suggestion he'd been dreaming of. Should we run away? The question completely blindsided her. Still, he pressed on, painting a picture of them escaping to a nomad forest, starting their own farm and training together. Elizabeth, however, just shut him down with a dry scolding. Jack wasn't giving up, though. He insisted he knew exactly how Phelan and the Marioness treated her. He argued it would be better to just leave it all behind and find some peace. He even said she might find someone who would genuinely love her. But the second he went back to talking about farming and started bad-mouthing the Lord, Elizabeth's shout cut him off. She stopped him cold with a yell, begging him not to talk that way about their father, reminding him that he'd always hold that title no matter what. To her, the two of them were born from the old man's profound love for their mother, so they had no right to speak ill of him. She knew Jack hated him deeply, but she was determined to change the Lord's mind about her little brother, pleading with him to just hold on a little longer. All Jack said in return was that he was just so happy to see his sister, after all this time, which made her blush. He then stood up and told her to back away from the bars, and even though she was confused, she did as he asked. The moment she was clear, Jack gathered a ball of mana in his hand, leaving his sister absolutely stunned and firing off a storm of questions about his hidden powers. With a flash of power, Jack shattered the lock and swung the cell door open, stepping out to pull his sister into a tight embrace. Through his tears, he offered a heartfelt apology, saying he was sorry for absolutely everything. She grabbed him by the shoulders, her face etched with worry. His behavior was just so bizarre, it made her seriously wonder if her little brother was feeling okay. Our boy just smiled and reassured her that he was perfectly fine. As they held each other, he declared that this time, things would be different. She wouldn't have to sacrifice a thing, because he was going to work hard so she could live any life she wanted. But then, a dark memory surfaced. He knew that soon, she was fated to meet the fourth prince. In his previous life, that was the man who took his sister from him. Back then, she had no idea what kind of fate was waiting for her. It was that absolute monster who twisted Jack into a beast himself, and flashes of the horrific tortures he was forced to commit flooded his mind. He remembered capturing that monarch, chaining him to a torture table. The pure rage felt like fire on his skin. He swore he would never, ever forgive the Tolkien Empire for what they did to his sister. In his past life, Jack had run away from home when he was just 17. 10 years later, the world was a different place. The Taslan kingdom was gone, and his home had been wiped off the map. Tolkien had risen to become the undisputed empire, ruling the entire western continent, and House Valentier had barely clung to survival. But memories of his sister, who was somehow still alive, came flooding back. Back then, she was the wife of the fourth imperial prince of Tolkien, and she was desperately pleading for her family's lives. But she wasn't a legitimate wife, and that royal piece of trash just shoved her away, telling her not to bother him with that kind of nonsense. But even then, Elizabeth never lost her kind heart. She stayed on her knees outside the palace, begging for 3 solid days and 3 nights until he generously decided to grant her request. At least, that was the official story that spread like wildfire across the continent. But the real truth behind his so-called generosity was absolutely horrifying. Elizabeth was constantly thanking him, saying she didn't know how to possibly repay his kindness. However, the prince just slammed her against a wall, telling her she had the wrong idea. He made it crystal clear he could crush her entire house anytime he pleased, and the only reason he hadn't was because the timing wasn't right yet. In exchange for their lives, she had to become his puppet, acting out whatever he commanded. He turned her into a personal plaything for his sick and twisted games, no better than a servant. And for some cruel reason, the prince's legitimate wives were eaten up with jealousy over it all, right up until the moment he finally got bored of her, throwing her into a forgotten room in an annex, leaving her alone and terrified at the mercy of the other women. And it was right at that time that the house of Valente was utterly destroyed. So, by the time Jack finally made it back, all he found was a pile of ashes where his home used to be. And after learning the whole story, he unleashed the monster within. He swore an oath to wipe the Tolkien Empire off the map, along with anyone even remotely associated with it. He started at the top, taking out the Empress, the Princess, and the wives of the princes, and kept going until he had destroyed every family that backed them. He didn't stop until not a single soul was left, refusing to risk leaving even the slightest trace of them alive in that world. Now, flashing forward to the present, Jack looks at Elizabeth in the cell, dead set on not letting history repeat itself. Of course, the poor girl was completely in the dark about any of this, only worried about her little brother. She asked him to be careful while she went to talk to their father, and he just gave her a solid nod, assuring her he'd be fine. This time around, he was prepared to do whatever it took. As she walked away, her mind was racing. Her little brother had changed so much. He used to be the type to keep his head down and avoid trouble. But now, he had this newfound confidence she'd never seen before, a fresh start, and that magic he'd used was seriously impressive. Even as a powerful Sixth Circle user herself, she couldn't detect a hint of dark magic on him. However, their father possessed the power of the Seventh Circle, which meant something was seriously off if he couldn't sense his own son's power. Elizabeth entered her father's study, found him sipping tea, and immediately pleaded for Jack's release, insisting he hadn't learned forbidden magic. She thought that stuff was just a legend, so there was no way a clueless little kid could ever stumble upon it. She figured his imprisonment was just a show to keep things under wraps. She even argued that Jack couldn't care less about being the heir, but her words only seemed to provoke the Lord. And she kept going, stating that this wasn't just a punishment for her brother, but a warning aimed directly at her. Her sharp words clearly caught him off guard. He hadn't expected his daughter to be so clever. Being nothing more than a pawn to make life easier for the Marquis family had trapped the girl in a fate she knew all too well. This was, without a doubt, a warning for her. A warning about what would happen to Jack if she did anything stupid or tried to reject her own destiny. The Lord then coldly stated that Jack has no place in that family, so once he comes of age, they'll announce his death and send him away under a new identity. Elizabeth froze, completely stunned. She had actually been hopeful after what she mistook for her father's kindness, but he drove his point home. Don't you forget your duty until then. And that goes for the future too. She got the message, staring at the old man's cruel watchdog. The Lord then commented that he couldn't figure out how a boy with no circle managed to beat the second son, a third circle user, which made the girl incredibly nervous. What did he mean? No circle. If that was the case, what did she see back in the prison? But her father cut the matter short, stating he would release the boy as she requested. With that settled, she asked for permission to leave and thanked him for the favor. But the second that door clicked shut behind her, she completely broke down. She remembered Jack asking her to run away with him, knowing it was an impossible dream. Her legs gave out from under her, and she crumpled to the floor, sobbing her heart out. The morning sun streamed in, lighting up Jack's face. He'd spent the whole night having dreams about his past life, which he just chalked up to sleeping in a strange room. He didn't have much time to think about it, though, as a guard unlocked his cell to announce he was being released. Jack stood up with a smirk, marking that he was just starting to get comfortable in his new digs. The guard held out his clothes, and the boy sarcastically thanked him for his kindness. However, when the guard refused to return his shoes, claiming none were available, that was the last straw. Our MC lost his cool and started yelling at the guy, asking if he thought they were best friends or something. The guard hesitated, trying to backpedal, but it was way too late as Jack was already channeling a huge amount of mana into his fist. Then, the kid unleashed a merciless beatdown to teach his servant a lesson. A little while later, the boy got dressed and headed back to the palace, where he was met by the ever-cheerful Ron, who ran over the second he saw him in the garden. His eyes were filled with genuine concern as he checked the young master over for injuries. Noticing the dark stains on his clothes, Ron got even more worried, but the boy just told him to relax, saying it wasn't his blood. However, his gaze quickly shifted to the guards patrolling the property, noticing there were way more of them than usual. The butler explained that 10-foot soldiers and a squire from the Order of the Iron Blood Knights had been assigned to the Marquis family. Among them, one Iron Blood squire really stood out in his gleaming armor, a total mismatch with that grim look on his face. Poor guy, Jack muses, sizing up the warrior a knight with so much potential, now stuck babysitting some spoiled brat. This definitely wasn't in the job description when he signed up to be a knight. Catching the guy's tense stare, our hero figures the blonde dude must have already gotten the lowdown on why he was locked up. The knight walks over, gives the young master a respectful bow, and gets straight to the point, asking if he'd be willing to share what went down in the prison, if it's not too much trouble. That actually makes Jack's jaw hit the floor. The guy's way more polite than he was expecting. The blonde knight then adds, explaining that he'd just seen a report claiming the kid had permanently relieved a guard of his fingers and right eye. Ron, totally furious, jumps in right away, insisting there's no way the third young master would ever do something like that. But the knight holds his ground, saying that regardless, he has a right to know why his colleague was attacked. Jack cuts him off with a sarcastic laugh, muttering a curse that clearly offends the knight. A right, he echoes, like the very word is a personal insult. His eyes sweep over the knight, taking in every detail to guess his circle. Probably the fourth. You know, he says. I'd expect a dog of the Marquis to know its place. The blonde knight fires back, complaining that he's being way too harsh. But Jack just doesn't get what's so out of line about calling a guy a dog, and Ron gives him a scolding look. Already annoyed, Jack lays it out for him. His only job is to stick close and keep an eye on him. He's free to do whatever else he wants. He can even go clean something, take all the time in the world for all I care, but he shouldn't be talking to me about rights. And since he supposedly knows what it takes to be a knight, he suggests the knight stay in his lane and pray he doesn't step out of line. The knight just lowers his head, completely submitting, and asks the boy for forgiveness. That bow brings a smirk to Jack's face as he mentally celebrates his new, well-trained pet. Satisfied, he turns his back on him, cutting the conversation short and telling the knight to just report whatever he concludes after cleaning up this mess. And if he's got any complaints, he can take them straight to the Marquis. As a final touch, he adds that the knight's new nickname is Chick, and he better come running when called. With that, he and Ron head back inside the palace, leaving Chick standing there in stunned silence. When his stomach starts to growl, our protagonist tells the butler he's seriously craving some meat, if that's okay. So, the butler assures him he'll get right on it. An absolutely incredible meal is whipped up just for the boy, more than enough to fill our hero's stomach, which makes him compliment Ron's amazing skills in the kitchen. But noticing the tense look on the butler's face, Jack tells him to just spit it out and stop staring at him like that. But Ron still seems hesitant. Jack offers the older man some meat, innocently suggesting they eat together. The butler, however, can't bring himself to accept, asking how he could possibly dare to share a meal with the young master. Jack just tells him to sit down already and cut the formal speech because they have something important to talk about. So, the butler gives in and sits down at the table with him. Getting right to business, our hero asks about his sister's condition. The butler simply replies, Lady Elizabeth is the same as always, but his eyes have the look of a helpless kid. Even though his words are blunt, Jack makes it clear he knows Ron is an idiot. He says that out of everyone, Ron should know better than anyone just how much his sister is suffering, which makes the man tremble. Still, Ron tries to stick to the story that he doesn't know anything, but the boy cuts him off. Jack repeats his compliments about how good the food is, mentioning how he could always eat without a care in the world as a kid, all thanks to the butler who always checked his food for poison. The butler is clearly shocked that he knows this, but our hero isn't finished. Another key reason, he says, is that Ron is a men's circle mage. Once again, Ron is completely blindsided by how much the protagonist knows. Then Jack continues, as someone who was always by my mother's side, you must know, but I have no idea what my real mother was like, since she passed away when I was born. But, he continues, hearing everyone talk about how much Elizabeth resembles her, Jack figures she must have been a really good person. That's what he genuinely believes. Jack lays it all out, Ron protected his mother from the shadows, and her escort was a men's circle mage. He thinks to himself that if this were some cheap novel, he'd have tossed it for being so unrealistic. But this was the real deal. He recalled running away from home in his past life, with the butler at his side as his father's goons hunted them down. The rain that night was coming down hard, ratcheting up the tension. Those pursuers were most likely from the Iron Blood Knight's order, just like that chick from a little while ago. The Marquis had sent them to take out his own son. Back then, their captain was a Ninth Circle swordsman, and Ron laid down his life to protect him, unleashing an insane amount of mana against their attacker. Jack explains that when it all went down, he was terrified of the man after discovering he was the Ninth Circle mage who had traveled with his mother, but he already knew his mom was no ordinary commoner, a fact the Marquis was clueless about. Maybe even the butler was in the dark. If that was the case, the boy decides he's better off not knowing, since who the servant was now is all that mattered. After that whole speech, the butler finally asked what the young master needed from him. Jack explains that Ron and his sister were the only two people he trusted, and he needed him to protect her. The request was odd, considering Elizabeth had already reached the Sixth Circle at just 18 years old, which meant she was more than capable of handling herself. But Jack argues that she was too kind, the type of person who wouldn't hesitate to sacrifice herself for others. But a life of sacrifice wasn't what was best for her. It was what was best for the Marquis. He tells Ron he's heading to the academy first thing in the morning and won't be back unless something major happens. He'll be there for 4 years and needs someone to watch over his sister while he's gone. After that, Ron would be free to do whatever he wanted with his life. Looking dejected, the butler asks what he meant by his life. Jack clarifies that he didn't mean the life spent hiding in his shadow, but the life Ron could build by finding out what he truly wanted to do. However, the butler gets curious, wondering why he'd be at the academy for exactly 4 years. The boy replies that after those 4 years, he'd finally be strong enough to protect Elizabeth on his own. Just as Ron asks who he needs to protect her from, they're interrupted by someone else entering the room. Even at a crucial moment like this, he couldn't just tell them to get lost. It was that chick again, announcing he was there to give his report. Apparently, the guard had already gotten first aid and was being sent off for proper treatment. Hearing this, Jack puts on a show of caring, which just eggs the blonde guy on to whine even more. He claims the guard accidentally sliced his own fingers during training and then dropped his dagger, which then stabbed him right in the eye. To top it all off, our MC sarcastically congratulates him on a job well done, asking if the mark was some puppy wanting a treat, a suggestion the man flatly denies. Jack calls him Chick again, only to be corrected by James Can, who finally states his name, but the kid couldn't care less, and announces he wants to learn swordplay, so he needs a real sword and a wooden one. But the squire, full of knightly pride, refuses, snapping that he's not some errand boy. Jack just calls him Chick one more time before asking if the guy has a problem with him. With a grin, he explains this is the perfect opportunity to rough him up a bit. Those words make Ron shoot up from his seat, while James asks if he's for real, getting a yes in response. The little punk even holds up his adolescent hands, claiming they've never even held a sword, so the knight could go all out on him in a duel. Just to be sure he heard correctly, the squire asks if the kid actually wants him to be his sword-fighting instructor, but Jack just busts out laughing, saying that's the third funniest thing he's ever heard and tells him to just go get the swords already. Once James is gone, the butler asks if the young master will be alright fighting a Fourth Circle opponent, but that possibility doesn't seem to faze our MC at all. Ron was worried he might get hurt, but Jack was so self-assured that he decided to propose a bet. Ron thinks it over carefully and suggests they bet on how many hits Jack will take, instead of just who wins or loses. This strikes the young master as a great idea, and he asks what the stakes should be. Even with all of Jack's confidence, Ron feels the need to remind him that the squire is on a whole other level, just to make sure he's serious about going through with this. He clearly didn't trust the kid's skills one bit. Seeing this, our MC suggests that the butler will win the bet if he takes even a single hit from the chick. The offer completely stuns him. What does he mean? Just one hit. On top of that, the boy wants the loser to grant one wish for the winner. For a moment, this seems to make the loyal butler a bit crestfallen, insisting that if the young master needed anything, he only had to say the word. After all, he was just a humble servant of the mansion. But that just made Jack want to mess with the guy even more. The kid pipes up, pointing his fork at the butler and declaring that Ron and his sister were the only ones he truly trusted. All Ron says in response is that it's rude to point with a fork, but you could see in his eyes he was loving every second of it, complaining on the outside while practically bursting with joy on the inside, and our MC totally calls him out on it. Putting on his most angelic face, Jack explains that he doesn't give orders to the people he trusts. He only asks for favors, and he just so happened to have one for the butler. The servant's eyes practically sparkle as he says that when asked so nicely, he could hardly refuse anything. Just then, their chat is cut short by James, who comes crawling back into the room on his knees to beg forgiveness for his earlier disrespect, pleading with our hero to take back what he said. Now, there were plenty of guys like this one who would disrespect Jack, even right to his face, but getting dissed indirectly and someone actually putting their hands on him were two totally different things, which led Jack to one conclusion. This guard was scared of the consequences. That had to be why he was on his knees, spouting all this nonsense. So, Jack asks if he'd rather go somewhere they could be alone, which just confuses the guy. With a smug look, Jack suggests that maybe the squire is just afraid of losing to a teenager. James's face twists at the accusation, and he quickly shakes his head, but the kid keeps pushing. So, you're absolutely positive you can take me? Huh? Jack taunts, reading the answer all over the blonde's face. Oh yeah, he was sure. Without waiting for a verbal answer, Jack turns to Ron and asks if he knows a place where they could train in private, completely stunning the butler. Of course, he couldn't lie to his master, so he spilled the beans about the perfect spot. A hidden basement in the back of the mansion, fully stocked with perfectly organized weapons and training gear. When they get there, Jack asks if the butler ever trains in this space. Ron says no, explaining that his mother had set up the room for her two sons. This leads Jack to wonder why he never knew about it then, and the servant points out it's because he never trained, which, fair enough. Thinking about it, even though the place was supposedly unused, everything was spotless. Someone had to be cleaning it regularly. Jack shoots a smile at the butler, thanking him for looking after the room, and Ron looks pretty proud of his work too. Finally, Jack's attention snaps back to the knight, who flinches when his name is called. Jack holds out a hand, demanding the wooden sword. Even though the blonde is hesitant, the kid keeps the pressure on until he finally hands over the weapon with a shaky hand. With his voice still quivering, his gaze turns to the squire, who remarks that our hero looks like he knows his way around a sword. That comment earns him a wicked grin. If Jack stacked up all the bodies from his past life, the pile would probably reach the heavens. He thanks him for the compliment and tells the knight not to hold back, even if they are just wooden swords. The two square off, and as the fight begins, James easily blocks and dodges Jack's initial attacks, getting a little cocky. But then, with a single, precise move, our MC presses the tip of his wooden sword right against the knight's throat. The man freezes solid, completely baffled at how he was beaten so easily. Ron has to shout to snap the young master out of his intense focus, warning the guy that if that had been a real blade, he'd be a goner. Jack scolds him for not taking the fight seriously, which was obviously not the case. The blonde is speechless, floored by the kid's swordsmanship, wondering if this was really his first time ever holding a sword. Even Ron was spooked by what he'd just witnessed. Just moments ago, the young master had charged in, and the knight had easily parried him to the side. It was a light tap, sure, but for a 14-year-old, it should have had more of an impact. In his mind, the kid should have ended up flat on his back, disarmed and defeated. But instead, the little brat moved with flawless form, executing perfect attacks and dodges. If that had been a real sword, James wouldn't have stood a snowball's chance. He had no idea what had gotten into Jack. As far as he knew, the kid had never even held a sword before, let alone fenced. Could he be some kind of sword-fighting prodigy? No. No way. Even a genius couldn't be this good this fast. While Ron is lost in his thoughts, the teenager asks James to confirm his age, that he was in his 20s. The squire replies that he's 23, which prompts our MC to ask when he first started training with Manhwa. So, the guy was 18. This news brings a maniacal grin to his face as he feigns excitement, asking if the blonde really hit the fourth circle in just 5 years. Honestly, that's some serious talent, especially for someone who started so late. Peeking at his internal mana, he figures the squire could easily hit the 8th circle, which would open up a ton of opportunities for his position in the guard. Without another word, the boy just drops the wooden practice sword. As James starts to question him, he snatches up a real steel blade this time. He thinks to himself what a hilarious waste of talent it was to be stuck on babysitting duty, then casually mentions he's starting to like the guy. Seeing the live steel in his hand, James immediately warns him that he could get hurt, an idea Jack finds absolutely ridiculous. This just sends Jack into a fit of laughter, which he cuts short with a dead serious, almost psychopathic look, explaining that there's a huge difference between being arrogant and being confident. He then presses the point, asking if James seriously thought what just happened was a fluke. The blonde is completely stunned into silence, his blood starting to boil with rage. And that's why you're still just a little bird, Jack taunts. This time, you come to me, beckoning him for round 2. At this point, James is grinding his teeth in pure fury and doesn't hesitate for a second, charging right at him. His hot-headed reaction just proves how easily he falls for a simple taunt. And just like before, James is disarmed in a flash, finding the tip of the young master's blade resting gently on his chin as Jack gives him a deceptively sweet smile. Jack points out that this seems to be his second loss of the day. James, completely baffled, angrily demands to know how the brat did it, but he just plays dumb, simply explaining that he had merely changed the sword's direction the instant their blades met. But James isn't buying it and insists on knowing the real trick. Showing off, Jack just smirks, claiming it's an advanced technique, and asks if he wants another demonstration. Even though his confidence is shot, the knight foolishly grabs a real sword for yet another round. Meanwhile, our protagonist casually turns to Ron to confirm he won their bet, and the servant can only nod in agreement. Ron asks what his master requires of him. Our boy explains that his request is the same as before: protect Elizabeth. He just needed to be absolutely sure the servant was up to the task. Ron freezes for a moment, then solemnly swears he would lay down his life to protect her. Back in the ring, the knight declares that this time will be different, prompting Jack to ready his sword and start channeling his own mana, since his opponent is using it too. Still, the blonde knight insists that Jack come at him with everything he's got. The moment their swords clash, James is instantly overpowered. The young master's mana surges through the blade and into his body, dropping him to the ground in agonizing pain. With James down, Jack makes a show of planting his foot on the knight's chest just so he can get a good look at his terrified face. Even though he barely has any strength left, James manages to ask how a mere first circle mage like the MC could wield so much power. It's a fair question, but the answer is actually quite simple. See, instead of spreading his mana evenly throughout his body for a general power-up like most people do, our boy concentrated all of it into a single point. Jack completely ignores the question, and instead asks if the squire truly wants to become an official knight. This just confuses James, who thought he already was one. The knight asks what he means by that, and that's when Jack drops an unexpected proposal on him. He wants the blonde to become his loyal hunting dog. As you can imagine, James is pretty offended by the offer, but our MC presses on, promising that if he becomes a dog who only follows his orders, he'll have a far better life than he ever would as a regular knight. The knight hesitates, clearly torn between his pride and his curiosity. So, he asks what exactly he'd get out of accepting the position, which seems to disappoint Jack, who grumbles that the guy is more interested in the reward than the job itself. Trying to ignore the blonde's terrible personality, our MC assures him he'll get all the power and authority he could ever want. As for his duties, they're very simple. He just has to eliminate anyone who gets in his new master's way or tries to cause trouble. The boy's ice-cold explanation leaves both James and Ron completely stunned. The first thing the knight asks is who, exactly, he'd have to take out. Jack just says the target should be obvious, referring to Phelan, who's still laid up in bed. However, Jack gives him one day to think over the proposal. Later on, after the training session, the young master is in his room with Ron. The loyal servant can't help but ask if it's not a little reckless to trust James, but Jack disagrees, prompting Ron to warn him that his words could easily get back to the Marchioness. The boy just laughs it off, but Ron quickly scolds him, reminding him that the Marchioness is just looking for any excuse to make a move. If she ever caught wind that Jack was heading to the academy tomorrow, she'd pull out all the stops to prevent it and might even try to permanently remove him from the picture. Despite that looming threat, Jack isn't worried in the slightest. He's fully aware she'd love to harm him, but he knows she won't actually go through with it. Ever since that incident with Phelan, his older brother has been terrified of water. The Marchioness was just waiting for her moment, but she's had her hands full. Can Jack stay vigilant with her and the Lord both trying to break Elizabeth's will? Given how delicate things are, she couldn't possibly make a move to finish him off. Ron looks torn, repeatedly asking if the young master is absolutely certain about this. Jack just scoffs, asking if Ron seriously believes the Marquis would ever allow that woman to pull something like that. The academy is the only place he's headed, so how could she possibly ruin him? At most, she'd probably stop after breaking a bone or two. Besides, a mere Marchioness could never pull off something like that. Far more powerful beings have tried and failed spectacularly. It's almost comical how delusional she is. With that settled, Jack thanks the servant for the massage. Ron, too exhausted to argue anymore, just mutters, "You're welcome." The young master then catches his eye and says his time to shine will come only when he decides it will. This clearly worries the servant, who asks if he's planning on just disappearing. Jack just laughs and says, "In a way, yes." But Ron isn't laughing. Jack then tells him that if he's really that curious about what's going down tomorrow, he should follow him in secret, which completely catches the servant off guard. Ron assumed he'd be accompanying the young master, but Jack makes it clear that's not happening, even making him promise not to be spotted. Before heading out, Jack informs Ron that he'll be forming a second circle in his room and that no one is to disturb him. Ron is utterly baffled. A second circle, he stammers, asking if that isn't supposed to be some monumental task. But for our guy, it's a walk in the park. Though clearly skeptical, the servant just agrees to do as he's told. As James roamed the castle halls, he couldn't stop replaying the fight with that brat. With skills like that, the kid had to be a third circle mage. He might even be a prodigy, but that proposal to turn him into a personal guard dog was just insane. It's not like the kid has the Marquis backing like his brother, and he has 0 vassals of his own. No, the third young master has absolutely nothing. And remembering the boy's talk about living a much better life wasn't helping his mood one bit. James had to admit it. He'd been too easily swayed by some kid who shouldn't know any better. He decides he has to tell the Marchioness everything from Jack's combat skills to their entire conversation in the basement. Meanwhile, among the mansion's maids, a certain blonde smiles to herself, realizing this is the perfect chance to get on the Marchioness's good side. No matter how much of a genius that brat is, there's no way he can take on the entire house of the Marquis, unless he's some kind of monster. At the same time, over in Elizabeth's room, the girl is being told that her mother, a mere commoner, gave her this one shot at a better life. The Marchioness sneers, claiming that being talented means nothing, because as long as she's the Marquise's daughter, the only thing of value she has is her pretty face. Elizabeth says nothing, the woman's cruel words clearly cutting deep. The woman offers her a glass of wine, commenting on what a sweetheart she is and telling her not to be shy about taking the drink. Elizabeth instantly refuses, explaining she can't possibly drink in front of the Marchioness. With a shrug, the witch throws back her own glass in one go and continues her monologue. She mentions that the sons of Duke Malone and the Asenbull family seem to have taken an interest in her, but then she quickly cuts herself off to correct the thought. Actually, the middle son would be a terrible match for you. The Marchioness declares she'll find someone much more suitable, and until then, Elizabeth had better take care of herself and stay in line. Then, out of nowhere, she asks if Elizabeth has her eye on someone, which the girl is quick to deny. This brings a satisfied smile to the lady's face. She explains that if there was someone, he would simply have to disappear without a trace. Then she starts going on about Jack, saying it seems he's plotting something interesting. Hearing Jack's name clearly unnerves the girl, who has no idea what her stepmother is getting at. The Marchioness reveals she knows all about Jack's conversation with the knight, gloating that the boy tried to win the knight over to his side. But what Jack didn't know, she cackles, is that James has been backed by her own son for a very long time. Elizabeth practically sinks into her chair at these words as the woman laughs like a maniac. To think he'd try to get rid of me using someone like that. That ridiculous idea of his is just too funny. All of a sudden, the Marchioness just cackles wickedly. The young girl's face falls, and she mentally blames her parents for Jack even thinking such things. But she knew she had to bite her tongue, or their animosity toward the boy would just get even worse. After laughing so hard her stomach ached, the woman finally gets a grip, turns to Elizabeth, and shuts down the topic by promising she'll keep looking for suitable marriage candidates for her. But there was one more thing she had to get off her chest, even if she framed it as concern. Wrapping her arms around the girl's neck, she practically hisses a threat in her ear. If you even think about getting tangled up with someone behind my back, you know exactly how that story ends. The poor girl is just trembling with fear. All she can manage is a whispered, "I understand." Her complete submission just delights the old crone, who praises her before sweeping out, reminding her to get ready for dinner. Looking completely defeated, Elizabeth just quietly agrees with her stepmother. As evening sets in, the maids start preparing for dinner. A few moments later, the Valente family members are gathered around the table for their meal. But then, the dining room door flies open, making everyone jump. And who else but Jack, waltzing in uninvited and having the nerve to ask why everyone looks like they're at a wake. Every single eye snaps to him, his sister is in shock, and the rest of them are just radiating pure disgust, especially his father. Putting on a totally fake innocent act, the boy argues that as the precious third young master of the family, there ought to be an empty seat for him. See, just a few minutes ago, he was deep in concentration, training his mana manipulation. Turns out, there are two kinds of mana circulation. The first type boosts your physical stats, we're talking enhanced intelligence, sharper senses, and especially a big jump in strength. The second method involves channeling mana into a specific formula to make it tangible. Classic examples of this are things like fireballs, ice arrows, and hellfire. Now, Ron was a first circle mage, while James was a fourth circle swordsman. Depending on how you wield your mana, you can end up as either a mage or a swordsman. And Jack? He was a swordsman, but that didn't mean he was a slouch when it came to magic. In fact, there he was, just casually radiating mana while sitting on his bed. The butler was staring at him, completely floored. But he quickly tells the kid that it took him a full 2 months to master the second circle. That's actually pretty impressive, considering it usually takes a first circle user several months to hit the second. I mean, unless you're a regressor like our boy here, pulling that off in just 2 months is a huge deal. Smiling, he compliments the butler, telling him he's incredible. This gets a laugh out of Ron, who says he's not sure he should be hearing that from someone who hit the second circle in a matter of hours. Speaking of which, the boy asks for the time, and the butler replies that it's 5:48 in the afternoon. He practically leaps to his feet, shocked at how much time has flown by. Since it's dinner time, he wonders if he should just whip up a steak like usual, but he immediately scraps that idea. His stuck-up family is probably in the main dining hall, stuffing their faces right now. So, he decides he's going to dine like a proper noble, a plan Ron thinks is pure insanity. But the boy tells a little white lie, using the excuse that he's just going to tell them he's leaving tomorrow. Back in the dining room, Jack is already tearing into a chicken leg, practically drooling over how good the main house's food is. The little rascal even has the gall to say it's tasty, but not quite as good as Ron's cooking. You can imagine how that went over with the family. After stuffing his face, he thanks them for the meal, but his father cuts in, asking if he actually came here to say something. And he confirms it, since there's no other reason he'd ever set foot in this miserable place. The sheer nerve in his voice makes the Lord think his son has lost his mind. But even so, our protagonist keeps poking the bear, asking his father why he's making such a strange face. The tension between them is so thick you could cut it with a knife, and Elizabeth begs Jack to talk with her outside, promising she'll get him whatever he wants, but the Marquis cuts her off. With the room dead silent, he tells the kid to just spit it out. So, Jack announces he's leaving for the academy tomorrow because he just can't take this depressing atmosphere anymore. Even while he's sulking, the Marquis actually approves his decision. Not that Jack was asking for permission in the first place, but to avoid a fight, Jack just says he's glad to have his father's blessing. With that business settled, our MC feels bold enough to ask about his brother, who practically jumps when his name is called, clutching his wine glass. He remarked that he'd heard Phelan couldn't even drink because of his little water phobia, so he must be absolutely parched. And even though this was the same brother who used to rough him up for fun, our protagonist still considered him family. With a wicked grin, he poured wine all over the dinner table, pointing out that since it wasn't water, he should go ahead and take a sip. Phelan completely freaked out at his brother's stunt, nearly toppling out of his chair, and the Marchioness absolutely blew a gasket, screaming that the boy was being disrespectful and demanding to know where he got the nerve. But Jack just turned his back, coolly stating that he had said his piece. As far as he was concerned, the woman's voice was just a yapping dog. He left the room in a heavy silence, knowing his words were going to ricochet around that mansion for a long time. Seething with hatred, the Marchioness swore to the other family members that she would not let that disrespect slide, and our boy just smirked, telling her he'd be waiting. You could still hear the lady's hysterical shrieks from the other side of the door as she cursed him, dead set on destroying that child. Out in the hallways, the maids whispered amongst themselves, trying to process the chaos they had just witnessed. But they quickly refocused on cleaning the wine-stained tablecloth. Despite the Marchioness's empty threats, nothing out of the ordinary happened that night, except for getting an earful from Elizabeth. On the morning of his departure, Jack wondered how the travel arrangements could be so plain. For a carriage with such a luxurious exterior, the inside was nothing more than a comfortable place to sit. The escort was led by a six-circle knight named Resison, who kept giving our MC a seriously suspicious side-eye, as if he was trying to figure out some secret plan. On top of that, James was also included in this little Uber ride to the academy. Worried about her brother, Elizabeth asked if he wanted some company for the trip, but he just brushed her off. The girl was on edge, knowing their stepmother was definitely plotting something. So, she insisted on tagging along. Since our boy is as stubborn as a mule, he told her not to worry, declaring that a lot of things were about to change and that he was genuinely fine. Besides, he was now confident that there was no way the family could ever harm her. Looking heartbroken, the girl kept following his carriage on horseback, which made Jack call out, asking how long she planned on tailing him. Finally, she gave in, begging him to be careful, as Ron watched him leave with a look of deep suspicion. The butler was visibly anxious, asking if the young master was absolutely sure about his decision, given the awful atmosphere back at the main house. He wore the same worried expression as Elizabeth and got the very same answer. Jack took a moment to remind him of the promise he'd made the day before, a task he was supposed to carry out that very night. There was no way the butler would forget. All the while, Resison watched their interactions with a suspicious glare. After getting Ron's confirmation, the MC stressed that he needed to take care of his sister, sending him back so she wouldn't be left alone. Ron did as he was told, wishing him a safe journey. The butler planned to follow the group from a distance to see what would unfold later. Jack considered this a little reward for the butler who always worked so hard for him. The cozy carriage soon had him yawning, feeling the pull of sleep, so he decided to catch a nap on the way. But the second Resison noticed the boy had dozed off, he shot him a cold, calculating look, clearly scheming. The journey dragged on until nightfall, and he stayed fast asleep until the dark sky finally registered. Jack sat up, demanding to know why no one had woken him. Seeing the servants setting up camp, he realized they were stopping for the night. James then approached him, putting Jack on high alert, and the two stared each other down in a tense standoff until our boy cracked a smile. Looking past James, he casually remarked that his little birdie had really decided to sing to the Marchioness after all. He was completely surrounded by guards. It wasn't like he could do anything now that the trap had been sprung. Resison said there'd be no small talk, but the brat shot back that he should at least try, promising to listen very carefully. The silver-haired man looked thrilled to reveal that during the 4-day journey to the academy, they would be camping out each night. However, Jack didn't see anything wrong with that until the man leveled him with a full-on psycho stare and said they would grind his bones to dust every single night, only to give him a healing potion at the end of each session. After Raisin finished his little speech, the kid wasn't even fazed, no fear, no surprise, he just told him to get on with it. Raisin laid it all out. The Marioness had another task for him. See, Jack had formed a mana circle, and everyone knew it by now. So, her ladyship's orders were simple: crush it. A nasty grin spread across Raisin's face, and that finally got Jack's attention. Shattering a mana circle was basically a death sentence. Even if you could somehow rebuild the broken circle, your odds of ever using mana again were about 1 in 1,000. And if that wasn't bad enough, the shock alone could leave you unable to walk for the rest of your life. The jerk kept talking, mentioning he'd already gotten the full scoop from James. Apparently, Jack wasn't just a prodigy with mana, but with a sword too. Raisin sneered that while that might impress some folks, it meant nothing here. because mere talent wasn't going to save him. He finished by advising Jack not to fight back, claiming it would only make things uglier. But Jack, he knew this kind of pressure all too well. Watching these thugs try to intimidate him, it felt like coming home. Because no matter how peaceful his new life had been, he was still the sword ghost. The wounds from his past were carved deep into his soul. So, he looked right at the head guard and started talking about the 10 years he spent locked away on a mountain, which, understandably, left the guards totally bewildered. He just kept going, talking about the master he met there, the one who taught him everything he knew. But when he finally came down from that mountain, everything was gone. His family, his kingdom, all of it had fallen. Not that he ever gave a damn about his family's legacy, to be honest. His cryptic words just confused the guards, who demanded to know what the hell he was rambling about. He didn't answer. Instead, he drew his sword, saying there was something else on his mind. And that something was what became of his sister, Elizabeth. She was brilliant and gifted, so he'd hoped that, even with a trash family, she'd at least be lucky enough to find a good husband. Meanwhile, at the palace, Elizabeth was staring up at the sky, thinking of her brother and desperately trying to believe he was going to be all right. He thought that if his sister could just live happily with someone she loved, he could forgive all the rest. His enemies just laughed, figuring he'd finally snapped from the fear. They figured there was no point in resisting in this situation. But Jack just kept walking forward, calmly stating that revenge is a much sweeter dish than they could ever imagine. So sweet. In fact, it could drive a man insane. And then he agreed with the guy, simple sword talent wouldn't be enough. With that alone, maybe he could survive their torture once. But then, mana began to swirl violently around him, and he declared that with his overwhelming talent and power, he could do a whole lot more. Seething with rage, Jack promised that from this moment forward, he would show them exactly what that meant. In an instant, like a brewing storm, his mana circle erupted outwards. And yet, the captain still scoffed, asking what he planned to do with such a pathetic little circle. A split second later, a horrifying realization hit him. If he didn't stop this kid right now, his entire squad was going to be wiped out. Vicious winds tore through the area as Jack unleashed a wave of mana powerful enough to level a city, aimed straight at them. Up until that very second, James had been regretting his choice. I mean, anyone would have picked the second young master over the family disgrace of the Valente Marquaz. But in that instant, time seemed to freeze. For the blonde guard, it felt like his life was already over. After the dust settled from the intense battle, Jack's sword was broken, but all those men were sprawled on the ground, utterly defeated. He then called out for Rom to show himself. And just like that, the loyal servant emerged from the bushes, asking in disbelief what on earth he had just seen. The two of them just stood there, staring in shock at the devastation Jack had caused. Jack casually explained that it was just one of the first 4 techniques from a set of 8 sword arts he'd perfected in some transcendent realm, before adding that he didn't really get what it all meant either. A nervous Rom replied that while he didn't know everything about his young master, that looked a hell of a lot more like a mana art than any sword technique. Jack put on a surprised face and quickly changed the subject, asking Rom if he happened to have a potion on him. But Rom's jaw dropped when he saw Jack suddenly start spitting strawberry juice. And not just a little, he was coughing up rivers of the stuff. Jack just waved it off, insisting it was nothing, and asked for the potion again. The butler fumbled for a flask in his coat, quickly handed it over, and Jack chugged the whole thing in one go. All the while, he was getting an earful from his servant, who pointed out that without that potion, the protagonist would have been a goner. And even in a situation like this, Jack just smiled, saying he knew that wouldn't happen because Ron was always so prepared for these kinds of emergencies. Besides, he knew Ron would have used the potion on him instead of saving it for himself. He was so certain because a similar situation had played out once before, in the past. He recalled lying unconscious in Ron's arms, with the butler being the only one by his side. Jack started rambling, admitting they'd both been too busy trying to survive in his past life to say what really mattered. He looked at Ron with glistening eyes and said sincerely, "Thank you for everything." He lamented how difficult it had been to say those simple words, muttering that his past self must have been a complete idiot. Hearing the young master's confession, Ron finally put it all together, knowing the future was the third young master's true secret. Jack then explained that he had regressed in time, a term his companions seemed to understand. Then, he pushed himself up from the ground. Jack was surprised at how good he felt, a clear sign that the potion he'd been given was top tier. He got to his feet, went to retrieve his sword and coat. That should have been it, but he took a moment for one last look, confirming that the little blondie was well and truly finished. Planting his foot on the guy's head, Jack admitted he'd love to turn the blonde into his personal errand boy. Ron commented that one could say he'd made a wise decision, but Jack disagreed, saying he never had much faith in the guy to begin with, before steering the conversation back to his time regression. He asked if Ron wasn't the least bit curious about any of it. Jack even tried to rack his brain for something that would pique the butler's interest, but came up blank. Jack offered up examples, like what happened to his sister or the Marcos family, but Ron had already guessed their fates, even if the details were still surprising. And just from Jack's expression, Ron could tell it hadn't been a pretty sight. Jack admitted he could spill the details, but only if Ron showed he was dying to know. He prodded him, asking, "So, are you curious or what?" But the butler explained that wasn't exactly it. This annoyed Jack, who yelled at the man to stop being so stoic. When asked about his own fate, Ron admitted he had wondered, but figured he would have survived regardless. A bit awkwardly, the butler said he didn't see himself as the type to die an early death, but he was completely caught off guard by the protagonist's reaction, who made it crystal clear that's exactly how he bit the dust. Now that was a surprise, and it finally piqued the man's curiosity, but Jack told him not to get too down about it. Ending the conversation there, Jack climbed into the carriage and announced he was going to catch some sleep. As he lay down on the bench, Jack tried to unwind while Ron walked over to one of the guards. Seeing the man was still breathing, Ron placed a hand on his head to make sure he stayed down permanently. He wondered if you could even call it a sword, the weapon used in an attack that took out 25 high-level knights. All of the men had their hearts pierced, but the wounds didn't look like they were made by a blade, leaving him baffled as to what could have caused such damage. Ron glanced back at the field of bodies and wondered just what kind of life Jack had lived before, feeling a deep concern about whether things would really be okay in the end. Sometime later, Jack shot awake, drenched in sweat, as Ron called his name. Ron asked if he was all right, considering he'd already taken a potion. Recognizing the voice, Jack admitted that no, he wasn't okay and was still in a lot of pain. The butler nodded in understanding and handed a pouch to the boy, informing him that he'd gone through the knight's things and found 5 high-grade potions, 63 gold coins, and 40 common coins. This haul took the teenager by surprise, who remarked that even these mantis dogs were carrying a ridiculous amount of cash. Seeing Jack close the pouch, Ron asked if he wasn't going to drink a potion, but Jack explained that it would be a waste to use another one right now, and instead handed 3 of the vials over to his servant. He said it was repayment for the potion Ron had used on him. As Ron gladly accepted, he felt like his single high-grade potion had just magically turned into 3. Ron asked what Jack planned to do with the bodies, but Jack had no plans at all. He was just going to leave them for the wildlife or for some unlucky person to find. This prompted the blonde to warn him that people would get suspicious if Jack was the only one missing from the group, which made Jack feign surprise and ask who on earth would be suspicious. It was obvious he was talking about the Marquis, but our protagonist already knew that even if his father suspected him, he was powerless to do him any harm. Meanwhile, Ron argued that if he were in the Lord's shoes, he'd summon Jack immediately to get the story straight. Smiling, the boy asked if he wanted to make a bet on it. The man quickly declined, knowing full well he'd lose again. After all, his master was just too sharp. Looking at the boy, the blonde knelt, saying that despite everything, he believed there was something Jack genuinely held dear deep down in his heart. Jack confirmed that no one else knew Ron was there, which was the honest truth. To be absolutely sure, the mage explained that he'd left an illusion back at the palace, which was probably still tidying up the annex as they spoke. The illusion was a 9th circle spell, basically a perfect clone, and anyone powerful enough to see through that kind of magic was currently taking a long nap. Changing the subject, Jack explained that the Marquis would surely wonder what went down here today, so he told Ron that if the situation got hairy, he should just tell him that Jack was the one who did it. In the absolute worst-case scenario, if the Marquis looked ready to tear him to shreds, he was to say the following: "If you or my sister die, that will be the beginning of the end for the House of Marquis." The two of them were silent for a moment. Ron admitted he was getting worked up over nothing, and the boy just burst out laughing, telling him it was just a hypothetical and he didn't need to look so serious. For now, all he could do was hope that the Marquis would actually act like a father to Elizabeth, as if to give her one last chance. Ron then asked if they were really going through with going to the academy, and Jack confirmed it, only to be hit with a ton of questions about his father's opinion on the matter. However, he didn't seem worried in the slightest, because even the academy had rules. Once the semester began, unless the head of the house or a direct relative kicked the bucket, returning to the mansion was impossible. That being the case, it was time for the servant to take his leave. Judging by the look on the butler's face, it was obvious he was itching to join the little brat on his adventure, which would be fun, but the timing just wasn't right yet. Thinking about that, the boy told him to be careful of monsters on his way back. The blonde then asked if it would really be 4 years until they saw each other again, something Jack also wondered about, but he couldn't say for sure. In any case, he repeated that the man had to take care of his sister, just as he'd promised. Now that he was without Ron, he had to cook up a new strategy. Seeing as the journey from the Marquis' estate to the academy required camping on the mountain 3 times, it would take 4 days by road, but also another 4 days hiking a trail. However, looking at the path, he realized the so-called trail wasn't much different from a regular road. So, he grabbed his suitcase, positive it was a sign that a village was nearby. The protagonist then went to mount one of the horses, or at least, he tried to. Being stuck in a small body was a real pain, and it took him way too long to finally scramble onto the animal. He continued on his journey in silence on a night so peaceful you'd never believe a violent battle had just gone down minutes earlier. Jack had no intention of going straight to the academy. For context, Nav's top priority was his master, Valentine Milos. She was the one who let him live, gave him the power to get his revenge, and turned him into a decent person. Despite being largely forgotten, she was the one who had reached the pinnacle of forbidden magic, the very embodiment of fear for those who still remembered her. As he rode, he wondered how long it had been since his heart had pounded this hard for something. He was now in Arbelo, the territory of Baron Arbelo, a vassal house. Upon arriving in town, our protagonist spotted an inn and debated whether he should crash there for the night. Right in front of the establishment, 3 children were chatting away cheerfully. Judging by their faces, it seemed like a great place to live. As he entered the inn, the boy saw all kinds of people sharing a meal, along with a very cute dog. After petting the little guy, he sat at a table, hoping that no one there would try and start something with him. The moment he took a seat, someone greeted him, remarking they'd never seen a customer so young in here all by himself. It was an incredibly warm-hearted girl who asked if he needed something to eat or a room for the night. Judging by her clothes, she didn't look like an employee. In fact, she looked more like a mercenary than anything. But the boy just handed her 3 coins, asking for a light meal, a drink, and a room, and also requested she take the sword he'd left by his table up to his room. However, the woman took only a single coin, insisting it was plenty, and told him she'd bring up some apple pie and meat, too, since he was a growing boy. With a kind smile, she asked if the kid wanted some milk or maybe a beer, but looking a little embarrassed, Jack said milk would be fine. As she turned to leave, she told him to play with Arnold the dog while he waited. It seemed like a decent place, and the woman hadn't tried to rip him off, probably because the war hadn't broken out yet. The dog was super friendly, and Jack muttered to him that he had no idea what the future had in store. He sighed, just thinking about what it would be like to live without a care in the world, completely oblivious to everything, until some gossip from a nearby table caught his ear. A group of guys were talking about a massive plan to wipe out demonic monsters using a ton of mana users. One of them couldn't figure out why anyone would bother with something so pointless, muttering that even the Tolkien Empire was stooping so low over nothing. The boy listened intently as a blond man voiced his complaints. The Marquis' forces are no joke. The Iron Blood Knight Order was being sent to the Demon Beast Forest on a subjugation mission, all on the orders of the King of Teslin, who was rounding up a huge number of private soldiers from every noble house and sending them to conquer the forest alongside some mercenaries. That massive forest, bordered by a towering mountain range called the Grand Canyon, was one of the neutral zones. It might have looked like an ordinary place, but it was home to ogres, orcs, goblins, elves, and the Yamugi, a serpent said to one day become a dragon. They used troll blood, ogre tendons, and even entire monsters as materials for crafting armor and weapons. Harpy feathers were turned into accessories, and elves were kept as pets by high society ladies. The only reason to try and conquer a neutral zone like that forest had to be pure human greed. Besides, the boy already knew the subjugation was doomed to fail spectacularly. The Iron Blood Knight Order would lose 1/3 of its knights in that battle, and the private soldiers of the other nobles would suffer a similar fate. It was a devastating defeat that cost the king all his support from both the public and the nobles. That's what likely sparked the division in the kingdom and, eventually, the civil war. The guy at the table yelled that the real problem was the king just trying to get attention. But his buddies cut him off, reminding him they were in public and that kind of talk was incredibly dangerous. The man had to be insane to say something like that out loud. At the other tables, guys were just staring at him in disbelief, trying to write him off as just another drunk. Jack realized the guy genuinely wasn't afraid at all. It was impossible to count how many people had lost their heads for bad-mouthing royalty. He snapped out of it when he heard his own name mentioned at their table. They were talking about him, the 3rd young master of the Marquis' house. One of the guys in the group mentioned a rumor that Jack had used forbidden magic, which the other 2 guys scoffed at, since they thought he was a total idiot. Our hero just glared at them. They had no clue who they were really talking about. The blonde guy even wondered aloud how that loser could have learned forbidden magic when the mage who knew it died ages ago. Meanwhile, the woman with them just laughed, asking if he wasn't the fool of the Marquis family, joking that he must have just stumbled upon it somewhere. Just then, the girl who brought his food came back, asking what was so funny. Her question threw Jack for a loop until he realized he'd been smiling while listening to them. She plopped down in the seat next to him and cheerfully asked if he was going to let her in on the joke, since she was super bored. He just brushed it off, saying it was nothing, just that the 3rd young master of the Marquis' house is an idiot. He admitted he was just repeating what he'd overheard, and the woman just shrugged, saying that's just how people are. He pointed out that they judged everyone based on gossip. Then, with a sly grin, he asked her what her own method was for sizing people up. The woman explained she only makes a judgment after seeing things firsthand, because rumors are just that, rumors. The boy shot back that rumors can be true sometimes, a point she had to concede. But she didn't get to say more, as Jack snatched a piece of pie and took a huge bite. It wasn't as heavenly as his butler's, but it was still delicious. The woman decided to drop the topic, saying it was just her 2 cents. But if the 3rd young master of the Manhwa family was this handsome compared to what the rumors claimed, then she wasn't buying a word of it. That caught Jack completely by surprise. She asked him what was wrong as he sized her up the scar on her cheek, her muscular build, and the fact that mercenaries were her regulars. So, the boy put two and two together and asked if she was the branch manager of the local adventurers guild. He caught her totally off guard, and she flashed an embarrassed smile. Of course, he wasn't just taking a wild guess. Every city was crawling with mercs looking for their next job. They got hired for everything from fighting in territory squabbles and finding lost things to even hunting down monsters. All these gigs were handed out by the local guilds, which were almost always located right next to an inn. This led Jack to cheekily suggest that she must have a lot of free time. There was no way she could be a branch manager and run an inn simultaneously, but the blonde woman explained that even with things being slow lately, she still needed to make a living in a quiet territory like Arbelo. It turned out the inn was basically the official lodge for the Adventurers Guild. Our hero remarked that she was playing a pretty bold game, and even though he was known as the idiot of House Marus, he wasn't exactly a celebrity. Yet, this woman had recognized him way out here in the boonies. How would a guild manager know who he was? And that's when he figured out the real reason she knew him. You see, upon spotting the village, he had told his horse that he knew they'd find some civilization nearby. However, right before he could stroll in, he was stopped by two guards who demanded to know why he was visiting and if he had anyone with him. Jack simply flashed his family's crest, which was basically an all-access pass to do as he pleased. The second they recognized the Manhwa family crest, one of the guards apologized for not recognizing the young master at first, and they both bowed, telling him to enjoy his stay before letting him pass. Back at the bar, he put it all together, suggesting she'd heard about him from the guards. He warned her that cozying up to a private soldier without the Lord's permission was a very dangerous game. This made her laugh, as she teased him for being worried about her. He cracked a crooked smile and said, "Yeah, for now, anyway." This woman was being kind to him, even though she'd only heard the nasty rumors, unlike his own brother and the knights who tried to wipe him off the map. She thanked him and extended her hand, introducing herself as Jane Arar. As they shook, her last name rang a bell. Arar. That was the name of the territory they were in. The pieces were finally clicking into place. Jane explained she was the third daughter of the ruling family, and her older brother was the lord of this whole region, a noblewoman who was also a mercenary. Now that was a job usually left to commoners, which made her all the more impressive. He asked if noblewomen her age weren't usually married off by now, but Jane said she loved her job. Besides, no one in her family would ever think of just selling her off. It was a stark contrast to Jack's family, making him feel a little jealous. But all he said was, "That's a great family." Jane then called over a little dog, and the two started to play as she continued their chat, asking what the young master of House Marus was doing in a place like this without an escort, to which he replied, "An idiot doesn't need an escort." His response left Jane stunned for a moment. He was actually pretty funny, which she hadn't expected, though she already had a feeling he'd be different from the rumors. Jack admitted that, even so, he had a long journey ahead and would like to hire some escorts, about 5 people, if possible, with camping experience and good cooking skills. The pay would be 2 gold coins up front and 3 more upon arrival. Jane's eyes practically sparkled at how generous he was being, and it was a great offer. After all, standard merchant escort missions only paid around 30 coins per person. The kingdom's currency was simple. It took 100 coins to make 1 gold coin, so they were a much smaller denomination. The woman committed to preparing everything by the next day and asked if he would pay for food and lodging separately. He pulled 3 gold coins from his bag and handed them to her, asking her to prepare everything and, if possible, also arrange a carriage with horses. He was indeed a very generous client. Kindly, she told him not to worry and to rest, and she guaranteed she'd gather only veterans, handing him the key. Since such a fun woman was a branch manager, nothing bad should happen in that city. Upon entering his room, Jack collapsed directly onto the bed as he was exhausted. He even thought about taking a bath, but fell asleep before he could. Suddenly, the boy woke up in chains in what seemed to be a cave while someone called him a pitiful child. He cried while this person asked if he would keep living so powerless forever. Tears fell endlessly from his eyes. Although being kind wasn't a sin, the woman considered being incompetent a grave one, so she asked if he wanted to change. With a trembling voice, the boy said yes. That's why the green-haired woman took his hand, congratulating him and wrapping him in a hug, saying that from that day forward, she would be his master. However, Jack woke up sweating in his bed. It was just a nightmare. Memories of his time with his master. The sun was shining outside, indicating it was already morning. He didn't even have time to process the dream because Jane burst through the door, wishing him good morning and shouted it, asking if she didn't know how to knock. With her was Arnold, who jumped excitedly on top of the boy, licking him all over. As he went down the stairs with his suitcase, the boy yawned sleepily, while Jane said he must have had a great night's sleep. That's why she had prepared high-quality transportation for him, and she introduced the men who would accompany him, making sure all were veterans. Ironically, among them were the guys who had been talking nonsense about him, now clearly embarrassed. The captain of the Fire Ant mercenary group introduced himself to Jack as John Doe. His nickname confused the boy. Smiling kindly, John Doe explained that it was a name given to unidentified corpses around there. He was blatantly using a fake name, but the protagonist ignored it and said it was a funny name as he shook his hand. The man said it would be a long journey from there to the Rocky Mountain, and they would have to camp about 2 times along the way. His two friends had once been chefs and had camped so many times they could be considered veterans, but all that mattered to Jack was leisure. So, the young master handed him his suitcase and hurried them, since he was already tired. Thus, the escort moved out of the place, but before leaving, the MC commented to the girl that she had introduced him to a very entertaining mercenary, and Jane reaffirmed that he was indeed a veteran. That would be the case if he were a normal mercenary. Rom was from the 9th Circle, and he hid his identity and power for his own reasons. But Joe Nobody, the 8th Circle mercenary in front of him, was hiding only his power for no real reason. Smiling, the woman asked if he hadn't said he wanted a veteran. And ignoring the question, the little one says he thought the two of them would meet again soon, and she assures him they'll have a beer together next time. He winks at Jane, saying he'd consider it if she paid for the last round, and finally leaves the establishment. From inside, she wishes him a good trip, as she already had a certain fondness for the little master. During the journey, the boy rested in his cart. It wasn't luxurious, but it was good enough. Besides, it was a beautiful day outside, and he felt much better than the day before. While playing with his mana, the MC notices that Joe Nobody was staring at him, wondering if there was a reason for that. He stands up, catching the blonde man's attention, and takes the opportunity to ask if he had any idea who the little guy was. Stammering, the man says he only heard that he was the son of a high-ranking noble. Jack pretends not to understand, asking him to continue, and the blonde man says that the branch manager believed the boy was traveling the world. The protagonist reveals he was very curious about Jane, so the guy tells him to feel free to ask anything. So Jack takes a pocket watch with his family crest from his coat and hands it to the man. Looking closely, he asks if that was the crest of noble house. However, by the look on his face, Jack concludes that the guy knew what it was about, but not exactly. So, he casually explains that right around here was the estate of some clueless marquis named Valente, whose house was on the brink of collapse, and that emblem. It was their family crest. His comment drops like a lead balloon, leaving the men completely speechless. Jack then adds, "You know, come to think of it, I do seem to recall someone from that house they used to call an idiot." With a sly grin, he asks if the blonde guy also happens to know anything about some fool who even got himself thrown in jail a while back. The pointed question sends a shiver right down the man's spine. It looks like the penny finally dropped for one of them, which was no surprise, really, considering Jack had practically spelled out his identity. Yeah, after he got out of the slammer, he continues. A rumor started flying around about him dabbling in forbidden magic or some such nonsense. Noticing the tension on the blonde man's face, he asks, "Is there a problem?" He even tells the guy to lighten up and laugh like he did yesterday. But all the mercenary can choke out is, "I'm sorry." The funny thing is, the guy wasn't entirely off the mark. Our MC does know a thing or two about forbidden magic. After all, his master was an absolute legend in that field. Even as a swordsman, you couldn't help but learn about forbidden sorcery when you're around someone like that. But Jack figures, why mess with that stuff when these fists are in perfectly good working order? When he calls out Joe Nobody, the man nearly jumps out of his skin. The protagonist then theatrically asks why he kept his mouth shut while his buddy was trashing him, but was quick to defend the king. He puts on a big show of being deeply wounded by the betrayal, leaving everyone completely baffled, everyone except the group's leader, that is. The leader quickly cooks up an excuse, claiming he's just generally out of the loop. It's obvious the branch manager must have clued him in on Jack's identity and told him to keep it under wraps from the others. Regardless, Jack tells them to just let bygones be bygones, since they'll be stuck together for the next few days. Joe Nobody agrees, though he still looks like he's about to have a heart attack. Later that night, as they're all gathered around the campfire, the men start remarking on how rumors are really just that, rumors. This sudden change of tune catches Jack by surprise. The blonde man explains it's because Jack isn't anything like other nobles, who usually act like they're allergic to manual labor. Meanwhile, here he is, actually helping with the dishes. It definitely set him apart. And honestly, can you blame him for being in a good mood? The food was incredible, and our MC was stuffed with the best meal he'd had in this dump of a place. His only regret was thinking of poor Ron, who was probably miserable without him. Jack just explains that washing up was his way of paying for such a delicious dinner. Besides, he's a man who appreciates good food. That gets him thinking, so he asks the guys how they handle the night watch, and the man explains they just draw straws for it. The merc jokingly asks if Jack wants in on the draw, which makes him pout. He insists that a growing boy like him needs his beauty, sleep, and asks if the guy is prepared to take responsibility if he ends up short. On second thought, maybe they should just drop it. Since everyone was getting bored, they decide to tell some stories, and our MC kicks things off by asking what topic they should start with. He then picks a topic himself, asking them how many dragons they think actually exist in the world. He's pretty sure none of these guys have ever given it a second thought. The men bring up some founding king, or whoever he was, who supposedly wiped out all the dragons centuries ago. You know, the classic legend of the kingdom's founding. If you cut through all the fluff, the story basically goes like this. Julius Teslin killed all the dragons and conquered the entire western continent. He then built his empire right where the current kingdom now stands. But as time went on, that mighty empire eventually dwindled down into a kingdom. It was even reduced to a vassal state of the Tolkien Empire. Now, that's the official history everyone knows. But then Jack chimes in, stating there are 2 dragon lords in the Black Sea, 1 baby dragon in the Imperial House, and 5 more in the Forest of Magical Beasts. Plus, there are 8 of them just wandering around, he adds, at least that I know of. They're polymorphs, he explains, so just on this continent alone, there are at least 16 dragons. Of course, there's no way they're going to buy a story like that. I mean, dragons are just things from fairy tales. Nobody's actually seen one. Seeing their skeptical faces, the boy just laughs and asks if it isn't a hilarious story. He then explains that dragons can't mingle with humans anyway. There's an ancient pact preventing them, one that could threaten their very existence if broken. Joe Nobody pipes up, asking if that means the founding king didn't actually kill all the dragons. And that's the kicker, he didn't exterminate a single one. All he wanted was a chance to sit down and negotiate with them. To be more precise, the real heavy lifting was done by just 2 of his unnamed followers. But that was a secret he wasn't about to spill to some hired muscle. The mercenary then asked what the 2 dragons were up to these days, and Jack dropped a bombshell. The continent they knew wasn't the whole picture. It was just the western chunk of it. Across the ocean, it was a whole different world. He explained that, except for the baby dragon, the dragon lords had one single mission: to guard the barrier in the Black Sea. Joe Nobody, naturally, asked about this barrier, but even Jack didn't have all the details, only that it was some ancient thing separating the continents, and the dragon lords had basically inherited the job of protecting it. Truth be told, even he was curious about what the eastern world was like. After that wild tale, the mercenaries couldn't hold it in anymore and just burst out laughing at what they thought was a bunch of nonsense. The blonde guy walked up to Jack, saying he was a fantastic storyteller and probably only hired them so he'd have an audience for his tall tales. Jack just smiled, fully aware that none of them took him seriously. He'd expected as much. They were never going to believe him anyway. The young man got to his feet, saying it didn't matter if they believed him or not, and announced he was heading back to the carriage. One of the mercs asked if he was turning in for the night already. Jack confirmed, adding that he wanted to take a bath and change his clothes first. The merc even offered to be his escort for that, but Jack shot him down, saying he was perfectly capable of bathing by himself. As he sank into the water, our protagonist let out a sigh of relief. Those loudmouth mercenaries hadn't believed a word of his story, which was kind of weird, considering he dropped some real facts in there and laid it all out. But hey, a protagonist who hides his power is just boring. That's exactly why he ran his mouth so much. Jack kept on soaking in the relaxing hot springs, but his mind drifted to Joe Nobody. He started to wonder if the guy was a spy sent by the Tolkien Empire. The guy was a little off, and that branch manager had seemed kind of shady too. The more he thought about it, the whole situation felt like a puzzle piece jammed in the wrong spot. He'd asked Jane to set him up with some mercenary escorts, but an 8th Circle mana user hiding his real name wasn't exactly what he had in mind. Someone as powerful as an 8th Circle mage. Heck, the captain of the Iron Blood Knights was an 8th Circle. In other words, a guy who would be welcomed with open arms anywhere he went had just shown up as the leader of some random merc group. Was there something else going on here? But instead of getting hung up on that, he had something more important to do first and started circulating his mana in the water. He'd already recovered a great deal from the after effects of the soul speech during his time at the inn and on the road. This shouldn't cause him any trouble. Regardless, all that mattered now was getting to his destination, which would finally lead him to his master. But as long as he suspected Joe Nobody might be a spy, he couldn't just brush it off. It looked like he had no choice but to confront the guy directly. When he returned to the campfire, the men were surprised at how fast his bath was. Jack now had his sword in hand, explaining that something was bothering him more than he'd realize, and he just couldn't relax. The guys asked him what was wrong. The question itself felt like an insult to Jack, who shot back, asking if they were really that clueless about what was going on. He pointed his sword right at one of them, declaring that he was the problem, and then turned to Joe Nobody, demanding to know why an 8th Circle mana user was slumming it as a mercenary. Jack revealed that his destination was incredibly important, and he had no intention of bringing along someone who was so obviously hiding something. The blonde guy jumped in to defend his buddy, shouting, "What are you talking about? My boss is an 8th Circle." But Joe Nobody quickly cut him off. Playing along, he asked what Jack would do if he really was an 8th Circle. Jack smirked, saying that since he told them an interesting story, it was now his turn to tell one. And he wanted to hear a very interesting story about the man standing before him. Joe Nobody challenged him, asking what would happen if he refused. Jack just pushed his sword a little closer, warning that if his story wasn't good enough, he'd end up as Monster Chow. Or, are you maybe a spy from the Tolkien Empire? He asked, making one of the other mercs start to tremble. Then he threw out some bait, mentioning that Jane told him they should all grab a beer together sometime. But if you're a spy, then why should I trust her? The look on the mercenary leader's face shifted instantly. He demanded to know why Jack was suddenly bringing Jane into this. Our hero coolly asked if, after everything he'd just laid out, the guy still didn't get it. Aren't you just a little bit curious, he taunted, if that woman's last meal is going to be a beer or not? With an innocent smile, he asked what Joe, nobody is thinking, adding that this whole situation was getting pretty fun. You could practically feel the tension in the air. Jack had pushed the guy this far, and still, his mana circle hadn't moved an inch. He was either being extremely cautious or just hesitating. What a lucky dude. The boy warns him that he can't control his strength very well, so he wouldn't be able to hold back. He was fully prepared to cut him down the instant that circle so much as twitched. The choice was simple: live or die. So, he gives the man 1 minute, hoping he'd make the right call. Flashing back to yesterday at Jane's Inn, the woman had been telling Joe that Jack was a fascinating kid, completely different from the rumors. She could tell just by looking in his eyes that he was hiding a great deal. She was actually the one who put in the request for Joe Nobody on this escort mission. After all, you just never know. A boy like that could change everything for them. Who could look into those eyes and dare call him an outcast because of her? Anyway, back in the present, there was nothing left to say. Joe, Nobody was getting a terrible feeling from this kid, like a deer caught in a lion's gaze. His instincts were screaming that the boy was dangerous. It was strange, now that he actually stopped to think about it. How on earth did the boy find out he was an 8th Circle mage? Could Jane have possibly let something slip? No. Joe, Nobody immediately dismisses that thought. There was no way she would have done that. He trusted her, and she would have definitely told him if she'd said anything in his presence. The boy's countdown continued, 40 seconds, when the man finally speaks up. He suggests that if he truly were an 8th Circle mage, the boy wouldn't even be able to touch him. The man glares at the boy, wondering how a mere child could possess such a fierce gaze. But he doesn't back down. The person before him didn't even seem like a child. Meanwhile, his friend was about to die from a panic attack, begging him to just tell the truth already. Joe Nobody had no idea where to even begin. He was in a spot where he felt like he could be devoured at any second. The countless decisions he'd made over his years as a mercenary flashed before his eyes. But as someone who had always managed to land on the lucky side of things, he decides to go with his gut. Time was already up, and since Jack wasn't satisfied, the guy was about to get dealt with. However, right before the boy could move in, the man says something. He actually asks about Jane's situation, wanting to know if the MC knew everything. Joe Nobody's story was surprisingly short. It was a classic tale of love between a nobleman's daughter and a regular commoner, the kind of story you hear all the time. He met Jane when she was 19, and he was a 7th Circle mage. They fell in love at first sight, and their bond had only grown stronger ever since. It wasn't exactly a huge surprise. Apparently, there was a very personal reason they hadn't gotten married yet. But even as a commoner, an 8th Circle mage should be incredibly influential. A person with that kind of power doing simple mercenary work was still bizarre. Jack even considered that the guy might have stirred up some kind of major trouble. Well, considering that woman's personality, it was possible her family wasn't motivated by profit. Trying to put the pieces together, the protagonist asks if Jane was really just the branch manager of the Adventurers Guild in a backwater territory. He's just a mercenary. Jack takes the chance to ask if he only got close to him to see if there was some kind of benefit to be gained, which the man confirms, but our protagonist doesn't know if he can believe him. A story like that could be completely made up on the spot. Staring daggers at Joe Nobody, the boy asks what he thinks the Empire is doing with the baby dragon. The man just volleys back with another question: how would I know anything about a fairy tale? His response makes our boy crack a smile as he explains that Master is a title for those who have carved 10 circles into their hearts. But even they are clueless that beyond their level, there's a deeper realm with monsters that use the power of souls instead of mana. The so-called transcendence. This piece of information stuns everyone in the escort party except for their leader. Then the boy continues. In 2 years, Hankus Beckerman, a knight from the Tolkien Imperial Guard, will be declared the strongest swordsman on the entire continent. And he explains that this man will carry on the story of those transcendents, who were thought to exist only in forgotten history. But the interesting twist is that this unfortunate man didn't become a transcendent on his own strength. It was shaping up to be a fascinating story, and the man told the boy to keep going. Jack reveals that the swordsman replaced his own blood and half of his bones with those of a dragon. Because of that, he ended up as something that was neither human nor dragon. The look on Joe Nobody's face said it all. Everyone there was completely stunned. The whole idea of a human-dragon hybrid was just plain absurd. But the man cuts in, asking, what in the world does that story have to do with our current situation? The boy then explains that the Tolkien Imperial House has only one dragon. Now, even for beings that are practically immortal, you can't run too many experiments with just a single subject. That's exactly why they dispatched several of their most capable people to other nations. The primary objective was to gather intel. The second was to confirm if any other dragons even existed. That last part makes the escort leader just bust out laughing, saying it was an amazing tale for a piece of fiction. Without even glancing at the other mercenaries, the boy was certain they wouldn't believe a word of it. Judging by his reaction, it seemed Joe Nobody wasn't a spy after all. Crossing his arms, he asks, so, am I less suspicious now? The boy confirms, wishing him a wonderful life with the loyal guild manager and playfully reminding him to send a wedding invitation. Suddenly, however, something catches the boy's attention, and he whips his sword into a defensive position behind him. There was Jim Nobody, frozen with the tip of a blade at his neck, caught in the act of trying to draw his own sword. Jack makes it crystal clear that the only reason he's letting him live is because he understood Jim's initial suspicion. He pulls the guy in close and whispers so only he can hear, "This is the last time. If you ever let that bloodlust get the better of you again, I will personally turn everyone here, including you, into dust." That threat sent a shiver through the rest of the group, and they begged both of them to lower their swords and talk it out. The boy had really tried his best to get on good terms with the group, but it was a lost cause now. The whole boss and employee relationship is always a complicated mess. After that whole disaster, Jack heads back to the carriage to get some sleep while the men hash out what just happened. One of them asks why a guy with the potential to be a noble's captain would ever choose to be a mercenary. The blonde man remembers how, when they first met, the leader lied and said he was only a fourth circle, which really ticked him off. But since they had fought side by side for years, and his friend had saved his life before, he couldn't bring himself to be too hard on him. Having an eighth circle mage in the group was a massive relief, as it would cement their merc band as the most powerful on the continent. With that kind of backing, the man could become the mercenary king. But Joe seriously doubted that was in the cards. He figured his companion was just treating it all like a joke, since an eighth circle mage would never stoop to being a mere mercenary king. There were at least 4 known mercenary masters out there, but he decides to just shrug it off instead of arguing with his old buddy. A younger guy in the group then asks if everything they just heard was the real deal, and the leader confirms it. As shocking as it all was, the blondie tries to calm the group, saying that everyone has their own circumstances. But he can't help but wonder why the captain didn't react at all. Memories of the tense confrontation flash through the man's mind, making him sweat long after it was over. His hands still tremble, and the feeling of being inches from death is still fresh in his mind. He would never admit it, but he nearly wet his pants from sheer terror. Just as Jane had said, the boy was interesting, but extremely dangerous. The continent was already in total chaos because of the war for the Tolkien Empire's throne. But this situation felt different. Spies, dragons, and all the rest of it gave him a terrible feeling, like a gut instinct screaming at him to investigate more deeply. Days later, inside the carriage, Jack asks if they want to hear another interesting story. The mercenaries' faces immediately grow tense, terrified of what he might say next. The boy asks how much they know about the Lord of the Forest of Magical Beasts. They reply that all they know is the monster is at the 9th circle, but Jack reveals that, in fact, it's at the 10th. This news floors them, but he just says everyone will find out soon enough. What he really wanted to talk about was the past. His words spark the man's curiosity, and Jack takes them back in time 23 years ago, when rumors were swirling about the Lord of the Forest and the Harpy Lord. The mercenaries admit they've never heard of that, and Jack explains that orcs and harpies have been at each other's throats throughout all of history. They'll wage war for any little reason, and any mercenary who stepped foot in that forest knows that these two races are considered the absolute strongest there. Sometimes they're even called guardians because of their immense power. Jack then says the Harpy Queen and the Orc King actually had a thing, as hard as that is to believe. Initially, they coexisted peacefully as neighbors, but the moment Blackman ascended to Orc Lord, the whole dynamic shifted. 5 years down the line, trouble started brewing, and seeing the men's curiosity piqued, a smile played on the boy's lips. He continued the tale, explaining that when the love affair between Blackman and the Harpy Lord came to light, it sparked a full-blown revolt within their races. Jack went on to say that humans, harpies, and orcs are only separated by their species. Deep down, they all crave power, a desire that ultimately led to treachery. A faction of orcs and harpies used the forbidden romance as a convenient excuse to oust their leaders and turn on one another. However, their coup was a complete failure, and the traitors were utterly crushed. Joe Nobody then wondered why the tension between the races has persisted to this day. Jack explained that Blackman and Vala ultimately went their separate ways, choosing the prosperity of their people over their own love. It was a logical choice, but one that left a bitter legacy of hatred in its wake. The mercenary leader admitted he wasn't sure if the story was fact or fiction, but he did recall a time when the harpies and orcs weren't nearly as formidable. Then, a few decades back, they experienced a sudden surge in power, earning them the title of dominant races. Jack elaborated, revealing that the harpies had learned the orcs' combat techniques, while the orcs, in turn, mastered the secret spiritual arts that were once exclusive to the harpies. This incredible exchange of knowledge was only made possible by Blackman and Vala's decision to keep their races apart. Now, they are the undisputed rulers of the forest, and if Joe Nobody ever gets captured by either side, Jack suggested he tell them this very story. It might just be enough to keep them from taking him out on the spot, and gazing at the boy's innocent face, the man agreed it was worth a shot. Switching gears, he offered Jack a piece of jerky, which the boy gratefully accepted. It was Jane's recipe, and it was incredible. Meanwhile, far away in the Marquis's palace, the Marquis was hit with the shocking news of the attack on his third son's escort. His entire detail had been annihilated in the mountains near Arbalo. His informant added that expert investigators believed advanced magic was the cause. This sent the Lord into a rage, especially since it happened while his Iron Blood Knights were away. He immediately suspected the king or the duke, seeing this as a potential third-party threat. He ordered Gonzalez to launch a full investigation, and the man simply nodded in agreement. The old lord then hesitated before asking about Jack's whereabouts, noting that since no body was found, the boy might have actually escaped. But if that was the case, he could possess information vital to the Marquis. With that, he gave Gonzalez full authority to extract the truth by any means necessary. But before the redhead could leave, the Lord mused that he always considered his son useless, but perhaps he had been mistaken. This comment earned him a long, serious look from Gonzalez before he finally departed, lost in thought about what truly transpired. The following day, as the group reached the entrance to Rocky Mountain, Jack handed a heavy sack of coins to Joe Nobody. The man's eyes went wide at the sight of so much money. He nervously took the pouch, insisting it was far too much. Jack, however, explained that all he needed for himself was 10 gold coins and a few healing potions. The rest, he said, was for them. With a warm smile, the boy thanked them for making the journey interesting and even apologized for ever doubting Joe Nobody. But their paths diverged here, so he wished them a safe trip back. Joe Nobody, however, didn't move a muscle, prompting Jack to ask if they weren't planning on leaving. Joe Nobody admitted he was probably overstepping, but asked if he could speak his mind anyway. After the boy gave him the nod, he told Jack that the mercenary life wasn't as bad as he might think. Jack was confused by the sudden statement, so the man pressed on, trying to explain his logic. He explained that even without knowing the full story, he'd seen what happens to young masters who lack support. The third son of a noble house, finding himself completely on his own. That was a strange and dangerous position to be in. Jack cut in, asking if he was suggesting he become a mercenary. In response, Joe Nobody gripped his shoulders firmly and insisted that the mercenary life wasn't as terrible as he imagined. As long as he steered clear of the really dangerous missions, he could see the world and live a comfortable life without taking huge risks. Jack glanced over at the other men, knowing they were clueless about what Joe Nobody had figured out. That night, the two of them had faced off. If the boy had truly wanted to, he could have wiped the floor with him, and without even breaking a sweat. The older man knew this for a fact, and that's what made it such a damn shame he wouldn't become a mercenary. The kid's talent was undeniable. He then admitted that, as far as he was concerned, what happened before was already water under the bridge. In a world where he'd first picked up a sword just to survive, he had learned to hide his true strength, even from his own crew. He hated to admit it. He admits it was all his fault, and while Jack appreciates the sentiment, he says he'll just pretend he never heard it. Since Joe Nobody was a different breed, without getting into specifics, our hero mentions a future event, something huge that's set to go down in the West in a few years. He tells the man to lay low when the time comes, which understandably leaves the mercenary baffled. But Jack explains he wouldn't get it now, though he'd feel it when the moment was right. It would be this gut-wrenching feeling, like something way too big to handle, and that would be his cue to run. Handing over the pouch of coins, Jack advises him, "Don't get yourself killed over a little gold, because nothing's more valuable than your own life." The man wholeheartedly agrees, and Jack is relieved his words hit home. He gives the guy a friendly pat on the shoulder. Before heading out, Jack once again tells them to be safe on their way back and gets ready to enter the forest alone. Joe Nobody asks if he can know his real name, and Jack just smiles, knowing the guy had probably already figured it out. Our protagonist introduces himself as Jack, asking to be remembered just like that, no titles, no last name. Seizing the moment, Jack asks for Joe Nobody's real name, who hesitates for a beat before answering. He reveals his name as Denistismo. The protagonist then says that if fate wills it, they'll cross paths again someday. And with that, Jack continues on his way, using mana to speed across a long bridge. He can feel he's getting close to his destination, pushing past giant stones that his body can barely withstand. His movements, however, aren't nearly as nimble as they used to be, and he has to pause to catch his breath. Upon reaching a high cliff, he lights the path with a small sphere of mana, confirming he's in the right place. The only thing left is to get through a massive stone wall to find his master, just like he did in the past. Finding this place before had been a complete accident, the result of him running away from home and the suffocating exhaustion of that miserable life. Jack opens a flask and pours the liquid onto the wall while getting a firm grip on his sword. He knew there was only one final step remaining. He had to slice his own hand along the blade. A necessary sacrifice. The boy stares at the sword, fully aware that this small action was far more significant than it looked. Before he was sent back to his 17-year-old body, all Jack ever did was run and hide, just like in his previous life. For him back then, who had even lost Ron, running away felt like the only choice he had. His trembling hands could barely make the small, necessary cut, and he cried like a child. For a person like him, just opening the stone cave had been nothing short of a miracle. Now, he found himself in the exact same situation. But this time, things were going to be different. As he passed through the entrance, the boy walked with confidence, knowing the place like the back of his hand. He went down a staircase lit by a single small lamp, though he could feel a growing sense of nervousness. It was understandable, seeing as more than a decade had gone by since he was last here. At the bottom of the stairs, he dropped to his knees at the sight that awaited him. There she was, his master, chained up just as before, her eyes flying open as she heard the boy's voice. Jack wondered if any form of life could ever truly achieve immortality, not just the powerful, but anyone at all who wanted to live forever. Monsters and emperors alike all eventually die. It was an unchanging law of the universe. That same truth seemed to apply to the person before him, despite her incredible abilities. His master from his past life had survived for at least 400 years by using a body-soul separation technique. However, a specific magic maintained a connection between them. But even that extraordinary magic was now hitting its natural expiration date. He had met her when he was 10 years old, but the situation now was different. This time around, he would have no more than 13 years to spend with his dear master. The woman, appearing as a chained doll, asks if he truly called her master, making him emotional. He had been longing to hear that voice for so long, and a powerful wave of nostalgia washed over him. She expresses curiosity about his identity, asking if she should venture a guess. Adela asks if he thinks this is some kind of joke. She demanded to know who he was, warning him that he wouldn't get a third chance to introduce himself. Laughing, he remarks that her temper seems to have gotten much worse over the years and says he's missed her terribly all this time, which only confuses the woman even more. She finds it interesting to have a disciple she doesn't even recognize asking if he knows who she is. The boy nods that he does. After all, how could he possibly forget someone so important? The time they shared was incredibly precious to him, far more real than a dream, even if he was the only one who remembered it. In his heart, those memories were absolutely real. He then introduces himself as the hero who ended the Age of Glory and ushered in the Age of Humans, informing the great sorceress, Valentine Milos, that he is her disciple from the future, which leaves the woman completely stunned. What do you mean from the future? She despised storytellers and their fabrications, asking if he already knew why. The boy knew perfectly well, stating it's because stories always warp the truth with personal bias. Annoyed, she says she ought to call him the boy with a knack for spinning yarns and asks what someone like her would say in such a ridiculous situation, challenging his wild claims. The atmosphere becomes tense, but the only thing that comes to the boy's mind is a simple yet long-lost word. That was probably the exact thing she would say, and she had to recognize his uncanny talent for imitating her. She jokes that the boy has a real gift for storytelling and could make a career out of it, which offends him slightly as he calls her master. The woman immediately corrects him, stating she is no one's master. Her response only confirmed that she hadn't changed at all. She was the same person as before. Realizing words alone wouldn't be enough, the boy rises, determined to try a different approach. In a single, fluid motion, he points his sword directly at the chained woman. He apologizes for his insolence, but he knew it was absolutely necessary. With the sword aimed at her, the woman realizes that Jack can use soul aura. He says he knows he's being disrespectful, but he will humbly accept any punishment after he's done what must be done. This visibly unnerves her, and she warns him that if he breaks her chains, the entire place will collapse on top of them. Jack knew that. In fact, that was precisely why he intended to break them without a second thought. He advances toward the woman, the very one who had taught Julius Teslin, the so-called hero. Julius had promised his master he would return for her, but he never did. It took 50 long years for the woman to finally understand that she had been abandoned by that coward. Jack acts swiftly, shattering all the dragon bone chains that held her captive. Valentine screams as she realizes she's about to plummet to the ground, but she's caught by the protagonist, who assures her that he's completely different from that scoundrel Julius because he doesn't just talk a big game, he actually follows through. She holds back tears as she remembers the past, but the moment is shattered by the cavern collapsing around them. The ceiling begins to cave in from the shockwave, and Jack tells her to hold on tight. He knew the earth itself could be manipulated, so he activates 4 techniques at once: Mountain of Wind, Forest, Fire, and Mountain. While holding the woman in his arms, he unleashes a blast of mana powerful enough to obliterate entire mountains. Faced with such incredible power, his master asks again who he truly is. Impressed, Jack insists that he's just her disciple, because that's all that matters, not where he came from or how old he is. She's amazed that someone so young can master soul energy so perfectly, and the MC jokes that he's a disciple from the future, informing her that they would be spending the next 13 years traveling together. The woman brings her face close to his, scrutinizing his eyes to see if he's lying. This time, her expression seems to soften a bit, and she slowly asks if the boy really came from the future. Jack explains it was more of a time regression than an actual journey. It seemed he was telling the truth. Just as he realizes that she finally believes him, the boy collapses to the ground before he even has a chance to celebrate. The master warns that forcing a relationship never works, but he has his answer ready, arguing that if he hadn't acted the way he did, it never would have had any kind of connection at all. But she didn't consider this a relationship. Valentine admits that he's pretty good at arguing for someone in so much pain, and he retorts by asking who she thinks he inherited all that stubbornness from. Seizing the moment, he formally introduces himself as Jack, her future disciple, and states that he will submit to her guidance in this life as well. 5 days later, in the territory of Arsenal, Jack was wondering why his master had been completely silent this whole time. He wanted to know if she was still trying to organize her thoughts or if she had simply decided to give him the silent treatment. At first, she had suspected he was a descendant of House Teslin, but that was impossible. No one his age should be able to use soul aura. He starts to explain the nature of soul power, but then just stops mid-sentence, clearly expecting Jack to finish for him. Jack knew this was a trap. If he got it wrong, he'd be punished, just like in his past life. He clarifies that it's a power only a handful of elite mana masters are capable of using. The master confirms his answer, but stresses that the energy stored in his soul is freakishly high. This brings a smile to Jack's face. As much as he wanted to spill the beans about his past life, Valentine's stoic silence stopped him. She points out that his hands are practically humming with more dark energy than hers, which is news to Jack. She then asks if he's ever considered why he was granted something as rare as time regression. He'd been racking his brain for 5 days trying to read her, but it turns out she was just curious about the whole time travel thing. Memories of his past life flash before his eyes. Nights spent mercilessly leveling entire villages. Jack admits he's thought about it, but honestly has zero idea why he was shown such mercy. Seeing her dead serious expression, he tells her not to look so grim and elaborates. This whole regression thing wasn't his idea, so if someone else is pulling the strings, they must have a good reason for it. And if that's true, that person will probably show up sooner or later. If not, he'll just keep on living. Either way, spending this time with her is what's really important, no matter what secrets are out there. His master quips that he's a smooth talker, at least, then asks what his next move is. Jack replies that he needs to find a companion. He needs someone he can put his life in their hands. The night he saved Valentine, he came down with a serious illness. He had to secretly chug 2 high-level potions, and even then, he was on the verge of death for several days. His body needs a bodyguard, someone to be his arms and legs when things get rough. But for right now, he's just going to go shopping with a girl. He also needed a new sword, but their plans get interrupted when a girl shouting "Make way" bumps into them, dropping her entire basket of flowers. She apologizes profusely, explaining she was in a huge hurry. Jack just shrugs it off, admitting they weren't paying attention either, and asks if she's okay, and that's when it hits him. He just said he was looking for someone to be by his side, and here's a potential candidate right on the ground. While the girl is busy gathering her scattered flowers, he asks her if she'd be willing to become his wife. The out-of-the-blue proposal leaves her completely stunned. Jack then tries to smooth things over by offering her the entire contents of his bag as compensation. She refuses, however, insisting that's way too much money. A single coin, she explains, would be more than enough to cover the damages since it's the exact value of her flower basket. So, Jack pays the coin, and she hands him the entire bouquet of flowers before taking off. She gives a hurried bow and disappears, leaving Jack just watching her go. His master then remarks that it's been a long time since she's seen a creature of the night. Jack just agrees on autopilot, repeating her words. But after a second, what she said actually registers, and he gets serious, turning to question her. He points out that the young woman didn't seem to have any weird traits at all. This just leaves Valentine looking confused. She figured he went up to the girl specifically because he sensed her true nature. In reality, Jack had singled her out because he recognized she had the potential to reach the 10th circle with the right training. Now perched on his shoulder, she can't believe he missed something so blatant. It's clear he still has a lot to learn. Jack just laughs and asks her to teach him all her secrets, but she says that's up to him. She comments that he's exactly the same as she remembers even after the regression. Still, the green-haired master can't shake the feeling that something is strange. That kid felt weirdly familiar. An old memory flashes in her mind, a blonde girl dancing in a garden. It all starts to make sense, and to think that girl is now reduced to living in this tiny village. Meanwhile, Jack's mind is on their next step once the shopping is done. He's got to find a certain someone. The creatures of the night are said to rival dragons in terms of raw power. As the shop assistant drones on, Jack thinks back to the war between the two races 10 years ago. It kicked off when the vampires tried to escape the forest of magical beasts, and even though they were defeated, plenty of them used the war as a chance to slip away. This means that the girl from before is likely the daughter of one of those fugitives, but Jack doesn't give a damn about her background, whether she was a creature of the night or the child of one. The shop assistant kept gushing about his choice of sword, but her endless chatter was really starting to annoy him. He cut things short, telling her to go ahead and finalize the purchase. Then, he called his master to announce that he'd already picked out his first subordinate. She was skeptical, questioning if he really understood what he was doing by choosing a creature of the night, but the protagonist argued that children carry none of the sins of their ancestors. His master insisted he was just making up excuses to justify his decision, which made him laugh. Back in the day, she had forged a non-aggression pact with the kings of every race, dragons included. According to their deal, all races except humans were forbidden from interfering with the human world. Because of that, all the other races moved into the magical forest. However, that all happened 400 years ago, so most of the kings who signed the pact were long dead and buried. Even without the pact, the creatures couldn't escape because the dragons were still lording it over them. And since dragons live for about 2,000 years, they were oppressing everyone in there just to keep the old promise. Motivated by their imprisonment, his master had made the right call at the time. But Jack thinks they should have just wiped out the dragons exactly like he did in his past life, finishing them off one by one after he figured out what was going on. Watching the little vampire girl, he saw a merchant casually pat her on the head and got Valentine's attention. She noticed the scars on the girl's fingers, but Jack quickly reassured her, saying she didn't need to blame herself. He knew the gist of the situation, even if he didn't know every last detail, and reaffirmed that no matter what he told others, he was her disciple. She told the boy to do what he thought was best, but warned him not to give the little blonde his juice under any circumstances, which left him totally confused. After all, the girl was just a kid who deserved good food, not strange restrictions. Later, the girl was still blushing, remembering how kindly Jack had spoken to her. She carried a cup of orc juice for her sick mother, following the rules of her family. Her mother had always warned her to never drink human juice, and more specifically, the kind her uncle provided. In fact, she was just wondering if he would visit them that day, as she announced she was home. Hearing nothing, she continued toward her mother's room, asking if she was asleep. In a weak voice, the woman acknowledged the little girl and warned her that they had a visitor, but she didn't see anyone until she spotted Jack. Startled, she spilled a little of the juice. Meanwhile, Valentine ordered the woman lying down to show her face, and so she did, revealing her pale blue eyes. "It's been a long time," the sorceress whispered, as the woman recognized her with a look of pure shock. She demanded to know what Valentine was doing in such a rundown place and in such a sorry state. After all, she was Vivian Royale, the noble vampire progenitor. Outside the apartment, the little blonde was distractedly playing with some birds while Jack watched her, looking bored. But he was listening intently to the women talking inside the house, hoping for the best. Vivian demanded to know who this woman was, suggesting she might be a vampire hunter. Valentine was surprised to see the vampire didn't recognize her immediately. So, she introduced herself as Valentine Milos, a name that sent a shiver through Vivian's entire body, confirming that she was, in fact, the one who had sealed the vampires in the forest of magical beasts, her mortal enemy. Her trembling voice gave away her fear, but she tried to stand her ground before her old foe. However, a harsh cough cut her off mid-sentence. Valentine explained she's under a curse and can now only live as a human for one night per month. Without mincing words, she asked again why a vampire progenitor was in such a pitiful state. Noticing that Vivian hadn't had any red juice in ages, she demanded an explanation for her condition. The vampire shot back, asking if Valentine was actually feeling sorry for her, which seemed pretty ironic. She said that back in the day, the mage was so great and powerful that she would have never dared to even get near her. It wasn't like she held a grudge about what happened in the forest or anything, since if it weren't for Valentine, her people might have been wiped out by the enraged humans. Therefore, she would answer the question. Vivian explained that there were 5 tyrants and 2 lords controlling the vampires back in the forest. She tried to escape during the war since her daughter was far too young for that hell, and she painfully remembered the dragon who spared them, offering exile in the village simply because she was too pitiful. That one word echoed in Valentine's mind. Vivian reveals the deal. She had to survive on nothing but the blood of pigs and cows, and in exchange, the dragon would let her daughter live. It was a humiliating existence for someone of her royal lineage, a point the sorceress was quick to make. Back outside, an impatient Charlotte is asking when Jack plans on leaving. She explains that her uncle is on his way, and he really doesn't like having company over. But Jack just brushes off her concern, telling her it's absolutely crucial for him to find out more about this uncle of hers. The girl is a bit creeped out by his sudden eagerness to meet her uncle. She even suggests he only befriended her to rob her rich relative, which seems to offend Jack a little. Waiting is boring, he complains, pushing her to just tell him about this mysterious uncle. The blonde girl racks her brain for something to say, other than the obvious fact that the guy's loaded. Charlotte explains that he's the one who gave them the house and that he brings them food every 3 days. And when she says food, she's probably talking about that animal blood. Before Jack can explain his curiosity, a voice echoes, asking if the uncle has finally arrived. The silver-haired man immediately questions Charlotte about her new friend, clearly suspicious of Jack's presence and remarking that he's never seen him around before. Despite the man's wary tone, Charlotte seems thrilled by his arrival, even though the tension in the air is thick enough to cut with a knife. Watching him, our hero internally celebrates that the infamous uncle has finally made an appearance. The uncle notes that Jack's appearance suggests he's from a noble house. Jack just watches his face a complete blank. Before him stood the dragon in disguise, just as he'd suspected, all while the newcomer keeps pressing him with questions. Suddenly, he realizes there's another guest inside the house. In the other room, Vivian had just asked the doll to go get Charlotte for her. Meanwhile, back outside, the tension between Jack and the mysterious man was so thick you could feel it, right up until his master intervened telepathically. He replies in his mind, letting her know about the man's arrival. She instructs him to bring both the child and the man upstairs. The stranger demands to know why Jack is muttering to himself, and the boy simply replies that he only follows his master's orders as he opens the door and calls everyone in. Jack knows exactly why the man is here. To watch his little playthings in their final moments. Inside the room, the mother tries to speak to Charlotte, but her face twists in despair the second she lays eyes on the visitor. The man mockingly asks why she looks like she's just seen a ghost, stating that he won't get in the way of her final moments with her daughter. Charlotte rushes to the bedside, crying desperately, asking if her mother is hurt and begging her to drink the orc juice she brought. She's certain it will make her mother better, but the woman gently refuses, telling her it's all right and thanks her daughter for going all the way out just to get her a birthday present. The conversation just leaves the poor girl confused, and she insists on knowing what's happening as everyone else just stands there watching the scene unfold. Originally, they had no real reason to be there other than by pure chance, but now they were all witnesses to a woman's final moments. Jack cuts straight to the point, asking if her name is Vivian and if she can trust him with Charlotte. It was time for him to make his move and create a reason for being there. The woman seems completely lost, so Jack decides to spell it out for her. To everyone's absolute shock, he asks how she wants her daughter to be raised, as a reborn vampire queen or as a progenitor ruler. And if neither of those options sound good, did she want to see the end of the very dragons who treated vampires like they were nothing but toys? His bold proposal gets an ironic smirk from the dragon standing right there. Vivian, struggling to speak, motions for Jack to come closer. She explains that she always knew her daughter's nature was different, and that all she ever wanted was to see Charlotte happy, just happy and smiling. Nothing else matters. She asks for his name, and when he says it's Jack Valente, she gives a faint smile, finally entrusting her daughter to his care. Jack promises he'll take full responsibility for the little blonde girl from this moment on, telling her she doesn't need to worry anymore. Calling out to Charlotte one last time, Vivian declares her love right before she dissolves into nothing before her daughter's very eyes. The little girl screams in despair, trying desperately to hold on to her mother as she fades away, completely unable to accept what just happened. Meanwhile, Jack and Valentine watch in silence, but the fake uncle suddenly bursts out laughing hysterically at the tragic scene, as if it's the funniest thing in the world. Commenting on how absurd it is for a brat like Jack to take responsibility for a child who's about to die herself. Vampires turning into dried-up twigs from starvation, he scoffs. He's still laughing when an enraged Jack slams a fistful of concentrated mana right into his face. The blow sends the man flying backward, but he just casually comments on the boy's rudeness, calling him a bad influence on Charlotte. Just as he threatens to teach Jack a lesson, Valentine steps in, demanding to know his real name, which left him totally baffled. It was weird, because he couldn't sense a single drop of magic, and yet the doll was talking to him in real time. She completely brushes off his confusion and brings up the other 5 dragons that were supposed to be in the forest, but were nowhere to be found. You're only 200 years old. Are you one of the adult dragons born back then? She asks, and his eyes blaze with anger. How could a doll know secrets like that? Who the hell are you, you freak? He snarls, his rage boiling over. The second Jack hears his master get insulted, he's consumed by pure hatred. Valentine asks to be put down, saying she can stand on her own 2 feet. She then formally introduces herself as Valentine Milos, the ancient mage, which makes the dragon's face completely change. No way. You mean the times immortal necromancer? He asks, completely stunned by the revelation. The woman just nods, acknowledging she's heard that nickname before. The dragon grinds his teeth in frustration and accuses her of shamelessly lying about who she is. In response, Valentine drops the names Bahamut and Volort, secret names only known to dragons and the very few who've met them. Hearing those names is all the proof he needs. The dragon finally accepts the truth, shocked that she's actually still alive. At last, he introduces himself as Velactus Machiavelli, a proud fire dragon from the Machiavelli line. He sneers at their shabby surroundings, admitting he was just there to get rid of the kid, the unwanted legacy of a woman he treated like his plaything. Valentine orders him to back off immediately, but he just scoffs at her, asking if she's forgotten their verbal agreement how they, the superior dragons, have always shown mercy to all the other races out of pity, except for humans. So who the hell was she to command a mighty dragon like him to stand down? But Valentine doesn't back down an inch, telling him he's got it all twisted. The mercy in that pact, that was always times her asterisk. A claim that sends the dragon into a rage. She lays out the truth of the ancient pact. Dragons were never merciful. They only segregated the races out of pure arrogance, believing they were better than everyone else. She's amazed that even after the Great War of the past, they still haven't learned a thing. The dragon just laughs off her history lesson, calling her a ghost from an irrelevant past. That's when a furious Jack cuts him off, calling him a disgusting lizard and explaining that he was planning to just listen quietly because, you know, he's a polite guy. But, he asks, how does a 4-legged beast dare to put on human airs and act so high and mighty in front of his master? That insult is the last straw. The dragon vows to rip Jack limb from limb, his claws extending menacingly. Unfazed, Jack charges in and delivers a phenomenal kick, sending the dragon flying into a wall. Pinning the downed dragon's chin with his foot, Jack warns, "From now on, you will treat Valentine with respect." The dragon spits blood, cursing the boy and screaming about how an inferior human could dare to touch a dragon of his status. Getting tired of all the talk, Jack tells him to shut his mouth and look down before he decides to end this for good. But the dragon retaliates, grabbing Jack's foot and flinging him into the air, screaming that Jack only thinks he can do whatever he wants because he's got Valentine Milos backing him up. Meanwhile, Charlotte is just watching in tears as our MC thinks to himself how much Ron would freak out if he saw him this filthy. "Your uncle is a complete piece of trash," he tells her, forcing the girl to finally see the truth. She immediately breaks down in tears, finally understanding what's been going on this whole time. Jack takes her hand and tells her to get a good long look at Valactus, revealing that this monster is the one who wiped out her people, killed her father, and treated her mother like a disposable toy. Charlotte tries to defend him, but Jack insists he just needs her permission to erase this guy's entire bloodline from existence. Right now, the only thing that matters is Charlotte's answer. "Let me show you the power of the person who's going to protect you from now on," Jack says, lunging forward with his sword. However, the dragon is faster, expertly dodging every single one of Jack's attacks. The two jump right back into close-quarters combat, but it looks like our boy is once again having trouble landing a hit. The dragon mockingly comments that after all that big talk, he expected a lot more from a mana user. But clearly, Jack was nothing special. Before he can even finish his sentence, a lock of his hair drifts to the ground, severed by a precision strike. Jack just grins, completely satisfied, explaining that his hair was getting in the way, and times they can finally fight for real. The surprise attack makes Valactus unleash a stream of the foulest curses imaginable. Fed up with the games, he unleashes a devastating wind-slicing attack at Jack, who shocks him by actually managing to block it. Even Valentine is stunned, as the kid completely nullifies the dragon's magic with his own power. The fight rages on until the boy finally floors the vampire, pinning him with a boot to the face. Right then, he suddenly remembers his enemy's identity. It's Machiavelli, the son of Luca Machiavelli from the Forest of Magical Beasts. This revelation makes the vampire go pale, realizing Jack knows his father, one of the 5 draconic lords who ruled the forest. Jack could never forget the dragon whose head he'd taken in his past life, but he'd never actually run into this guy before. Judging by his current state, he must have met an early end somewhere, or had just been laying low. The kid asks why the guy is such a chip off the old block, and the vampire snarls, demanding to know who that idiot is. Jack introduces himself as the one and only disciple of Valentine Milos, the very woman the vampire despises. The defeated dragon can't believe it, questioning how a mere human could shatter his soul speech, a magic that was supposed to be absolute. Honestly, it was a pathetic sight. This wreck on the ground didn't look anything like the world's supposed apex predator. He gives the defeated foe 5 seconds to apologize to his master, holding the blade to his throat. But even with his face in the dirt, the prideful Valactus asks what would happen if he refused. Jack coldly replies that he'd obliterate him so completely, not even dust would remain, just like he did to a certain someone else. You could cut the tension with a knife as the countdown ticks away, with everyone watching in dead silence. Then, at the very last second, Valactus unfurls his massive dragon wings and bolts into the sky, deciding it's better to retreat. For now, he just needs to get back to the forest and warn the others. Jack looks up, hesitant to burn more mana, but he knows things just got a lot more complicated. He then unleashes the next form of his soul sword, creating a massive vortex of mana that rips through the sky. This definitely catches the escaping dragon by surprise. It's the first form of power, drawn from the 4 realms, starting with the heavens. Valactus looks up in utter despair, finally realizing what kind of monster he just picked a fight with. Inside the vortex, the world turns to black and white, and Valactus is completely trapped. Terrified, he sees a colossal phantom of Jack closing in on him, screaming desperately for the phantom to get away from him. Then, suddenly, Jack jolts awake, startled, in a plush bed he doesn't recognize. He's in some luxurious room, looking around completely baffled when Ron rushes in, clearly surprised to find him awake. The butler immediately starts firing off a barrage of questions. "How many fingers am I holding up? Do you remember anything? How are you feeling?" Jack, getting annoyed, tells him to knock it off with the 3rd degree. He insists he's fine, but really wants to know what's going on. His first thought is for the others, so he asks about the girl and the doll who were with him. The butler explains that Charlotte is resting in the next room, adding that while he doesn't know exactly what went down, she seemed totally wiped out. As for Valentine, she's on the sofa. The butler points to the green-haired doll, asking if that's the one he meant. Our hero cracks a smile seeing Valentine and wishes her a good morning, but she immediately corrects him, deadpanning that it's well into the afternoon. This leaves the butler completely stunned that the doll can talk, and he nervously asks if she's angry. Valentine just replies dryly that Jack is free to do whatever he wants with his own body. Jack just chuckles, teasing that he knew she was worried about him. Ron, completely intrigued, asks how a doll can even talk, let alone stay motionless for 3 whole days. Jack says he'll explain later, insisting that for now, they just need to treat Valentine with the respect she deserves. Ron promises to do as he's told, still confused but trusting his master's judgment. When Jack asks him to fill him in on what's happened, the butler does his best to summarize the complicated situation. Apparently, the fallen members of the escort were discovered in the mountains, and naturally, a Marquis got wind of it. So, the Marquis' family sent knights to investigate, and suspecting Jack might have some answers, they started tracking him. On top of that, several people had seen him in Arbolo. They followed the trail all the way to the Aeson region, right where that epic sky battle with the dragon happened. That's where they found Jack, completely unconscious. They had no idea what happened, but he was in critical condition, so they immediately brought him to the temple for healing. Ron adds that Jack chugged 3 healing potions all by himself. Apparently, they tasted like strawberry. Jack just laughs, commenting that it's a funny coincidence since that's his favorite flavor. Switching gears, Jack asks what the servant is doing here instead of looking after Elizabeth like he promised. The butler gets flustered, explaining that Elizabeth wanted to come, but the Marquis shut that down. So, they sent Ron and an investigation squad with the Marquis' full backing instead. This news catches Jack by surprise. Apparently, his old man was even dumber than he thought. The vibe gets super tense when the red-haired informant from the Marquis just waltzes into the room. "What do you want?" Jack snaps immediately, while the spy looks shocked to see him up and about. Gonzalez introduces himself as the vice captain of the Iron Blood Knights, the one in charge of the investigation. With total disdain, he questions if Jack even gets that taking on a commoner as a companion is a bad look for a Marquis. He rips into the kid's abilities, saying he should at least act with some dignity. Before anyone can jump to Jack's defense, the kid tells them to pipe down and lets the redhead talk. Gonzalez then says he's got a few questions. According to the butler's intel, he bought 3 high-level potions for the 3rd young master. That means he should have only been able to handle 3 uses. Jack's confident attitude throws the informant for a loop, especially since he remembers when the brat couldn't even look him in the eye. The redhead reveals that Jack was the only one who made it out of the incident with the guard and demands an explanation. Jack just plays it cool, saying it was no big deal, just that his escort got some weird orders to rough him up, but he cuts himself off when he sees the guy's terrified face, realizing he doesn't know the whole story. Gonzalez pressures him to keep talking. "It was pretty nuts, right?" Jack says casually, mentioning what the knight leading the attack had planned. The informant asks if he's talking about Reincarnation, and Jack confirms, remembering how they threatened to completely wreck his mana circle. With a completely straight face, the kid states that he simply took care of all of them, which leaves the redhead in total shock. But the boy says it again, making it crystal clear he doesn't regret a thing. Realizing this was an inside job, Gonzalez is floored that the culprit is Jack himself. "This makes no sense. I never let anyone who tries to mess with me walk away," the boy says, asking if he looks like he's kidding. The knight warns him to watch his mouth, calling him a clueless little pup. Ron tries to step in but gets shoved aside and called a disgusting servant, which instantly sets Jack off. Without a second thought, our MC decks the redhead, sending him sprawling to the floor. That was the 3rd time he'd just taken it. However, he suddenly feels dizzy and collapses onto the bed, which totally freaks out the butler. The kid tells him he's fine and points out that the guy on the floor was just a 7th circle. He asks if Ron isn't sick of pretending to be some powerless servant, which makes the butler crack a smile. Tugging on his shirt, the kid tells him not to live like that anymore and admits he thought it'd be easy to keep up the act forever, but he's realized that's just not going to fly. He argues that at the very least, a servant should be treated like a person. You can see it all over Ron's face that he's loving this freedom. As the butler gets ready to make his move, Jack asks how much time he'd need to cook the redhead, suggesting 5 minutes. But the guy just laughs, joking that 5 minutes is way too long for his cooking skills. Of course, they weren't talking about food. Everyone in the room knew exactly what was up. Ron completely dominates Gonzalez, even while being called a damned servant over and over. The redhead tries to fight back, but he's no match for the butler's 9th circle power. Outside, the guards are baffled how a simple servant could be dishing out so much punishment. Jack watches the beatdown with a bored expression, trying to place where he's seen those moves before. Even as a mana circle user, Ron's foundation was in magic, not martial arts, and his build was pretty average. Gonzalez, a 7th circle knight, should have easily won a fistfight, but he was getting totally steamrolled. Even if he were a spy from the Tulkan Empire, Jack knew he'd never be able to win a fight against the butler. Getting desperate, the informant snatches a sword from one of the guards to try and strike his opponent. But before he can even swing, Ron drives a knee right into the redhead's nose, completely and utterly humiliating him. Our boy watched with a smirk of satisfaction. His servant had put up with disrespect for years and was now finally letting loose. Gazing down at his defeated foe, Ron turned as the protagonist called out to him. "What's the holdup?" "It's just one ingredient," Jack joked with a grin, but just behind him. Gonzalez was powering up for another charge, but Ron was quicker, landing a decisive strike that sent the redhead flying. "Definitely needs more practice," Jack quipped. Nearby, the guards were getting chewed out for just standing there like statues. Now that they were alone, the young master grabbed the redhead's hair, announcing it was time for a little talk. He laid out a proposal, pointing out that a talented guy like Gonzalez could achieve so much more. Even in defeat, Gonzalez tried to talk down to Ron right up until the boy yanked his hair. "Are we clear on where you stand now?" he asked, keeping a tight grip. He then presented his offer. Gonzalez could stay on as vice captain and get a chance to cultivate his mana. The man was in his early 30s and would undoubtedly make a fine vice captain. It'd be a waste to just get rid of him. He then dangled the ultimate prize. Wouldn't he love to reach the 8th circle? The knight's expression showed he was clearly tempted. Jack assured him this would be a private arrangement, just between the two of them. Watching from the side, Ron was wary of his young master's true motives, but couldn't help feeling proud of how much he'd grown. The moment was broken by Valentine, who tapped the butler on the shoulder to get his attention. He apologized for not sensing her presence sooner and began a formal introduction, but she cut him off, stating, "You carry the aura of the Sword family." Her comment left him completely stunned. Valentine deduced that Ron must have reached the 9th circle 2 decades ago, which pointed to an incredibly high-ranking past. "You could have even reached the 10th circle," she continued, implying he had the potential to become a true Grand Master. Ron was baffled, having no idea what she meant by soul control. It had been precisely 19 years since he'd last used his mana on a regular basis. He'd only tapped into it recently to keep up with Jack, simply because he had no other option. The butler reflected on how he felt no shame, even when disrespected. Serving was a choice he made freely. Valentine then asked how he could possibly be content serving that boy for the rest of his days. She had wondered about the source of such immense talent, but the answer was staring her right in the face. This was someone a member of the Sword family was willing to risk his own life to protect. And so, she asked if he knew the truth about the boy. But Ron admitted he only knew what Jack himself had chosen to share, maintaining his respect for the past that remained unspoken. Ron couldn't help but smile, picturing Jack's reaction, a bewildered, "What the heck is a Sword family?" if he'd overheard their conversation. Back with the redhead, the MC mentioned that normally he'd shut that mouth permanently, but he let it slide this once. He then re-extended the offer of the vice captain position. Noticing the hesitation, he remarked that he expected as much, watching the man's desperate squirming. "You're tired of getting your butt kicked, aren't you?" "You'd better hold still," Jack warned, casually sitting on the man's chest. Then, with surgical precision, he located the 7 mana circles surrounding the redhead's heart. He hoped the guy wouldn't hold what was about to happen against him. As Gonzalez flinched, the boy pulled him close, explaining that if he'd wanted to destroy his mana, he would have done it already. A surge of mana enveloped the circles, forcefully rearranging them as excruciating pain shot through him. When he finally opened his eyes, Gonzalez discovered he now possessed 8 circles. "That's going to ache for about 3 to 5 months, the boy informed him, leaving everyone completely floored by his display of power. The informant was in awe of the boy's ability to just create that by force. But now, Gonzalez was left with only one path forward: obey the young master's every command, or face the grim consequences. He then brought up the rumors about him wielding forbidden magic, all with a terrifying grin. Jack recalled the time he clocked Phelan and the subsequent rumor his father had started. And now, Gonzalez was cementing it as an undeniable fact in his mind. This kid really could use forbidden magic. He ordered the redhead to kneel and listen closely, because he was prepared to carve these words into his very bones if he had to. Gonzalez was to return to the Marcus estate and lie, claiming the 3rd young master was completely clueless. Furthermore, within 3 months, 40 troublesome members of the Marcus family were to be secretly taken care of. The redhead agreed, right before he realized the catch. Jack had embedded something within his heart that was far more than just a pretty pattern. It was a failsafe. "Don't be afraid," the MC said calmly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "If you do as I say, the rewards will be immense." The boy promised the pain would be well worth it, comparing the power of the 8th circle to an intoxicating drug. Laughing at the sheer irony of the night's events, he mused that he always knew the guy would be back for more. On top of that, he recalled how Gonzalez had trashed Ron on their trip, but now the tables had turned, and Jack announced that the redhead would be the butler's new lackey. The guy just mumbles his agreement, head hung low. With the deal sealed, Jack boots Gonzalez out of the room, pretty pleased with his new underling. He hoped his second recruit would be a little more compliant than the first. Turning to Ron, he asked if he was done talking with Valentine, and got a nod. Jack was starving and ready to grab a bite, but Ron called him out for planning to go out in those ragged clothes. The ever-prepared mage, however, had already laid out a fresh set of clothes, showcasing his typical foresight. Just as they were about to head out, Charlotte rushed in, throwing her arms around the boy with a trembling voice thick with worry. "I thought you were never going to wake up," she choked out as he, touched by her concern, hugged her back. He then called for their favorite dishes to be made, planning to share them with the vampire girl. He was amazed at how strong the blonde was, especially since she'd never had a drop of the good stuff. Outside, the orange sky lit their path as Jack apologized for wrecking her home. But Charlotte explained that even if it was still standing, without her mother, that apartment would never feel like a home anyway. Jack gently pulled the girl into a comforting embrace, revealing that he'd also lost his mother when he was just a kid. Charlotte was stunned to hear that, and even more surprised that he still managed to find happiness with his butler and master. He used his mana to make a bit of his own juice float over to her, offering the hungry vampire a taste she'd never experienced before. The moment she drank it, Charlotte felt a surge of pure energy course through her entire being. Her vampiric power had just been awakened. This is why vampires can go toe-to-toe with dragons, their ability to instantly regenerate using potent blood. Despite her initial confusion, Charlotte flashed a brilliant smile, feeling more alive than she ever thought possible. Jack asked what she thought about what happened earlier, when he promised to show her his power to prove he could take care of her. The little girl admitted she was scared, but also that it was exciting, calling him away with wide-eyed admiration. Jack gently corrected her, suggesting boss instead, which made her burst out laughing as she tried out the new title. Back inside the mansion, Ron was absolutely floored by the news that Jack had defeated a full-grown dragon. He explained that dragons under the age of 50 are already considered masters with fifth circle mana hearts. Their dragonoid transformation technique lets them shrink their massive bodies down to a human-sized form, which is way more efficient for combat. And while a dragon's true form is built for slinging magic, their transformed state is designed to maximize their power in close-quarters combat. If that moron Valactus hadn't given him an opening to use soul speech, he would have been in some serious trouble. Then, Ron cuts in, insisting Jack eat his vegetables and reminding him he's still a growing boy. But Jack just brushes that off and gets back to the topic, calling the dragon an inexperienced fool. After all, he was just a second-circle human and still managed to dish out that much damage. Jack couldn't help but think how bizarre this whole conversation was. Normally, the idea of killing a dragon would be completely insane. The Fire Ant mercenaries would have a heart attack if they knew what he pulled off. The butler's face went beet red when he realized the young master figured out he knew so much about dragons, all because he'd acted like a total know-it-all. But the boy just reminded him that all he'd said was that the man was going to die young, showing Ron exactly how he'd put two and two together. Ron reflected on the many secrets his master still didn't know and decided it was best they stayed that way. Jack knew Ron was never one for long-winded stories, despite his cautious nature in past lives. Even when they escaped the Marquess house together, the butler had kept his secrets locked up tight. Everyone's entitled to their secrets, Jack thought, but there was one crucial suspicion he had to confirm. He looked his butler straight in the eye and asked him point-blank about any ties to the Talcan Empire. The confusion on Ron's face was completely genuine as he denied any link to that nation, and Jack's relief was so obvious you could almost feel it, because that worry had been weighing on him for a long time. His calm smile showed he didn't want to burden his loyal friend with it, but despite the exhaustion from the battle, it was time to forge a new mana circle. Using soul energy always took a massive toll on him, which meant he needed stronger circles to absorb the shock. Valentine's voice cut through the boy's thoughts. She was shocked that he'd used the Dark Bond, a forbidden magic that only the two of them should have known, because she was the one who created it. Back during the war, that technique would bind a promise to a person's very soul. If that promise was broken, it wouldn't just shatter their mana circles, it would destroy their entire body. The mistress demanded to know what Jack meant by carving something into Gonzal's heart, and he coolly explained that he'd branded the redhead with a promise to keep Elizabeth and Ron safe. Ron is visibly moved, realizing just how deeply his young master cares about him staying alive. But the tender moment is cut short by the arrival of Charlotte, who bursts into the room in tears, upset about being dolled up by the maids. Jack invites her to join them for dinner, but she turns him down, still overwhelmed by the sheer amount of food. Jack then turns to his butler, asking if it's possible to get Charlotte enrolled in the academy. Ron hesitates, uncertain he could pull off such a request, given he's just a servant, but Jack insists, reminding him he's an incredibly capable one. When the flattery doesn't work, Jack sighs dramatically, saying it looks like he'll have to handle it himself. Ron immediately scolds him for resorting to emotional blackmail, but Jack just fires back that he's no criminal. Charlotte's eyes light up at the mention of school, a once impossible dream, and Jack confirms she's going, adding that children belong with other children. Besides, the girl's talent was too immense to let go to waste. Her age was a problem, though she was only 11, and the academy's minimum entry age was 14. But Jack figures Gonzalez can smooth things over with a simple letter of recommendation. With a confident smile, he tells her not to worry about a thing. Several days later, the group arrives at the academy. Ron says his goodbyes to Jack, handing over his bags and telling him to be safe. He even urges Jack to write if he needs anything, his concern evident. In return, Jack asks for a favor of his own. He wants Ron to take full responsibility for all matters concerning the Marcus house. Jack explains that he needs to be able to focus completely on his studies without any distractions from the outside world. Ron agrees, and Jack then remarks that Gonzalez wasn't nearly as sharp as he'd hoped. His contempt for the redhead is palpable. He sees the man as nothing more than a disposable pawn to be used and thrown away. Jack then reveals he gave the redhead a very specific order, one that he needs Ron's help to see through. The mission, he explains, involves severing some hands and legs. He quickly clarifies he's not talking about literal body parts. His real targets are the key officials of the Marcus household and the members of Count Mantus's family. It's a meticulous and cruel strategy. This move will put Miss Elizabeth in a difficult position, especially given her kind-hearted nature. Jack admits he doesn't want her to become like him, but he believes the downfall of her house might be the very thing that forces her to change. He then asks Ron to watch over her carefully, revealing a side that is both protective and calculating. Ron looks proud, remarking that his master has changed a great deal since everything that's happened, point Jack readily agrees with. As they step onto the academy grounds, his doll companion observes that while he has a monster inside him, he could still be called a good person. Jack seizes the chance to return the compliment, telling the doll she's a good person too, despite being so stubborn. She, however, dismisses his words, calling it meaningless flattery and refusing to soften her stance. Meanwhile, when Charlotte lays eyes on the academy, she gasps that she's never seen a place like it, her face filled with wonder. Jack tells her to take it all in, since this will be her school from now on, and her expression becomes absolutely radiant. Just then, a staff member from the academy approaches and asks if he's from the Valente family. At the same time, Charlotte instinctively runs and hugs Jack, who wonders what this woman wants. The staff member politely informs him that the headmaster is waiting for him in his office, implying a sense of urgency. It seems Jack is already quite famous here, thanks to his dark and notorious past. The tale of the blood-soaked noble's son discovered in the ruins of his estate was still the talk of the town. Even after all this time, the story resonated, especially with the father of the current Duke Asenol, the former Duke, Ramel Einhard Assemble. The headmaster's office is unchanged, looking exactly as it did in Jack's past life, and the sight triggers a vivid flashback. He remembers this very room, and a conversation about a critical test. He recalls questioning if that was seriously all he needed to do, and complaining about all the classes he was going to miss. But the old headmaster had assured him that as long as his name remained on the official ranking, he wouldn't get kicked out. With a heavy heart, Jack could see the disappointment in his own reflection, knowing his father and older brother were plotting against him. He was certain they'd try to take him out of the picture before he ever came of age. A harsh truth, the headmaster grimly confirmed. The old man had seen plenty of kids in the same boat, but the safety of a private room was all he could offer. Shaking, the boy wondered how he could possibly go on, feeling the crushing weight of loneliness and betrayal. The headmaster then simply patted his head, concluding that from this moment forward, it was up to Jack alone to forge his own path. But in this new life, our boy is brimming with confidence and cracks a smile, proposing a wager that catches the headmaster completely off guard. He explains that he owed the old man a debt from a past life, and now was the time to pay it back. All he asked for in return was one small favor, something that could completely flip the script once more. Hearing this, Ramel remarked that the kid had changed drastically since he'd first found him, all beaten up and barely able to speak. To the headmaster, it might have been just a month, but for Jack, it had been a full 20 years, more than enough time for the world and everyone in it to transform. Intrigued by the proposal, the old man asked how exactly he planned to save his life since, if he was right, the kingdom was doomed to fall to the Empire within a single month. The kingdom of Tesla had put up a brave fight, but the Empire boasted 30 masters on its side, many of them hybrids with implanted dragon, blood, and bones. On top of that, Tolkien had over 1,000 mana users ranked above the 7th circle, while Teslin had a measly 2 masters and fewer than 100 high-level warriors. With a power gap that massive, 1 month was generous. In fact, 3 days would be plenty if our hero were a Tolkien commander. The sole reason Teslin had held out this long was Headmaster Ramel and his personal army of battle mages, around 700 soldiers he trained himself. If it weren't for that accident, or more accurately, the betrayal by his most trusted advisor, the kingdom might have lasted another 2 months. The moment Jack mentioned the traitor's name, the headmaster's eyes went wide, and he chewed Jack out for addressing an instructor by name. But the boy didn't even flinch. He coolly explained that Brutus Marcos was a spy for Tolkien, the current vice-instructor of the swordsmanship department, a 6th circle knight, and a vassal. A flustered Ramel immediately shot back, calling it slander, and warned Jack he'd regret not taking his words back. But the boy just smirked. In a few years, when he sticks a knife in your back, you'll be thinking, I really should have listened to that kid. Our MC's taunt completely shredded the old man's remaining patience. Livid, the headmaster warned him not to make claims he couldn't back up, preferring to just pretend the whole conversation never took place. Ultimately, he let the boy go, pulling out a pocket watch with a crest and promising he wouldn't breathe a word of this. Then, dead serious, he told Jack to summon Brutus to his office. And just like that, the boy did. Once inside, the man stood before them, kicking things off by complimenting our protagonist's hard work before casually informing him there was no longer a need to send reports to the Empire. The look on the guy's face was absolutely priceless. He froze solid, asking what on earth the teenager was talking about, but Jack just laughed. His patience worn thin. Our boy said the man wasn't deaf, just playing dumb, telling him to make it easy on everyone and just confess already. Realizing the jig was up, Brutus scrambled to defend himself, suggesting Jack was suffering from some kind of psychological trauma and warning him about the consequences of such an accusation. But our short-fused hero had already had enough, and before the spy could finish his little speech, Jack chucked the watch right in his face and declared that he talked way too much for a traitor. This caught the man completely by surprise, but our protagonist remained unfazed. Totally confused by the chaos unfolding before him, Bernardo demanded an explanation from his superior But before he could get an answer, Jack lunged forward, landing a precise strike right on the man's chest. Seeing his superior get hit, Bernardo snapped and charged again, demanding to know what our MC thought he was doing. With incredible agility, Jack easily sidestepped the counterattack, leaving the instructor even more stunned by the kid's unexpected skill. In that instant, Jack could sense the six-circle mana shielding the man's body, but he knew that even the toughest opponents have a weak spot. Exploiting that opening, he delivered two vicious blows to his opponent's gut, sending him flying backward with brutal force. All of a sudden, violence left the old headmaster completely floored, while our boy stayed as cool as a cucumber, dead set on prying a confession from the spy. It was almost painful to see the man's pathetic state, now crumpled on the floor, his face already showing the signs of the beatdown he just received. The kid then demands he start talking, laying it out plain and simple. Cooperate, and this is his one and only chance to walk out of here alive. But Brutus sticks to his story, playing dumb about the accusations, which just earns him a cold smile from Jack, who then places a hand on the man's chest, feeling out his resistance before targeting something way more fragile. He knew that well-formed mana circles were tough to crack,